Chapter 16. Angharade flinched, but she did not die. No, the ball hit the tree about a foot to the right of her head. Bark went flying, and a heartbeat later both cultists keeping watch turned her way. She felt Cosm going still as he was caught leaning out of cover. The cultists shouted, and just like that the traitor had killed them. There should have been a burst of movement, of surprise and fear and hatred, but instead Angharade breathed deep. The urgency bled out of her, slowly but surely, as a great silence spread. Stillness hung in the air, like the world had been seized by the throat. The fishing line struck the scene before her and the impact rippled out, as if rid on water. Angharade Tredegar stood stranded on an island shore, stones digging into the soles of her boots. She looked down at herself, seeing on the water the moment where time had gone still. At once she knew she still stood there, in that other place, but also that so long as she stood on this forlorn shore it was nothing but a reflection on shadowy waters. The ripples calmed, showing again the crystallized act of Augusto Cherdin's betrayal in perfect detail. Without turning or daring to move an inch, Angharade knew that there was something besides her. An entity great and terrible, so much that her mind trembled at the very thought of beholding it. The fisher's steady breath was as a gust of wind, the spirit patiently fishing in the moment become water. "He betrayed me," Angharade finally said. "I knew he would, but to think he would go so far. Master Cosm and his brother, even Isabel." She ground her teeth, seething with impotent anger. "He is a man without honor," she bit out. Above them there was only darkness, as if they stood under an eternity of nothing, but Angharade somehow knew there was a ceiling. This was a cavern, resounding with the quiet echo of water lapping at the shore of the island within it. Where the spirit she had struck a pact with still waited, his patience as absolute a truth as the coming of the tide. "Honor," the fisher said, slowly speaking the word as if feeling it out. The fishing line struck at water, ripples turning the moment into a confusion of color and lines, and the spirit hummed. "A worthless thing." She rocked back as if he'd struck her across the face. Anger and surprise fought fear for the barest of heartbeats. Long enough she looked at the spirit. A hulking shape towering above her, more fortress than man, and in the dark she could make little more than a silhouette. But she saw the trails of ichor, the rivulets of black on gray skin that bled down from the crown of his head. They dripped down the fisher's body all the way to the stones beneath his feet, staining them black. There was a basket on the other side of him, tall as she and full of wriggling things. Instinct screamed at her not to look at it too closely. "It is not," she sharply replied. "It is priceless." The fisher shook his head, chiding. "Its price is known to all, Angharade Tredegar." His voice was not a man's voice, with emotion and cadence and all the shades of humanity. It was a spirit's, as much the glimpse of something she could barely comprehend as a sound. Her mind told her she heard the sound of the sea against stone, of bones shattering like twigs, but she could not half explain why. Against her will, Angharade wrenched her gaze away. She was trembling, slick with sweat. The spirit was not meant to be beholden by mortal eyes. "Why were you betrayed, child?" "Fear," she said. "Fear and jealousy." The spirit laughed. It was a sound utterly without joy, a wound ripping open, a friend abandoned in the dark. "Because you are weak," the fisher corrected. "I am not weak," Angharade hissed. "I have earned 10 stripes, spirit, and one against the victories of a child," he dismissed. "You fight a woman's battles, now, yet still hold them up as trophies. Why should they not betray you? It is nothing more than what you deserve." "We had a truce," she shouted. "He turned not only on me but on his brother, on Cosm and Isabel. How can you claim I am at fault?" "Truce," the spirit repeated, amused. "Another word. How many will you hide behind?" "Keeping your promises is the foundation of the world," Angharade bit back. "Of everything we are. There is only one foundation to the world, child," the fisher said, with a certainty like iron and stone, like tide and decay. "The eldest law, whose name is extinction." And now she understood, for she had learned at her father's knee as much as her mother's. The old songs, the old tales, the old ways. She had come here in the dark, on the eve of death, and the spirit she had bargained with was testing her. Angharad swore she would not prove unworthy. "That is despair, spirit," she said. "I refuse it. It will not own me." And she meant it, for all that she had a role to play. Angharad was not without fault, and sometimes she bent honor or twisted it, but she would never renounce it. If there was failure, it was hers and not that of what she aspired to. Even if she fell short all her life, why should she cease trying? The final betrayal of what you were was to surrender to the tide of the world, to let it decide who you were to be. "Perhaps it is not writ in the bone of Vesper that honor should matter," Angharad admitted. "But it can be made to, and I will fight to make it so." She readied herself for pain or anger, for the test of her resolve, but the spirit only flicked his fishing rod. Lights swirled, and below the waters she glimpsed shapes moving. "And so you are betrayed," the fisher said. "You claim rights you have not won, acting as if your desires are born worthy of respect. Why do you still exist, fisher, if the eldest law is absolute?" she challenged. "It can be stalled," the spirit said. "That, too, is true. But only strength can achieve this, and you are weak. Your will is dull. Your enemies defy you with impunity." Shapes circled around the bait under the surface, as above lights scattered like a broken mosaic. "Laws," the fisher told her, "are the right of the strong in them alone. Your honor is not a law, it is a noose." Her heart clenched with fear. It did not feel like a test of her mettle. There was no fearsome wrath, no pain or fear or battle of tricks. The fisher did not seem interested enough in her for this, and that more than anything else at a gaping pit opening in her stomach. Was this only a remonstration before her death, some kind of sick sermon from the ancient spirit? No, she told herself. Doubt is how victory slips away. It must be a test. It must. "I do not believe that," Angharad replied, looking down at the waters. She clenched her fists, knowing that as soon as the ripples settled she would once more see Augusto Cherdin betraying his kin and professed love for a better chance at running away. The fisher was not wrong, that the Infanzon had done it because he feared her not. Because he thought he would get away with it, that even if she survived she would be bound by oaths not to slay him for his treachery. All of this might never have happened, if she had simply let him fall last night. But that was not the whole of it, was it? If you begin to act in only the ways that helped you, if you care nothing for duty and dues, then you were as an animal. And that sickness, it spread until there was no law but the law of the sword, and the whole world was as a butcher's yard. There was a cost to peace, to plenty and safety, and Vesper being more than packs of wolves tearing each other to bits. Sometimes, you have to lose. To accept that you could not win every time, because if you could not, why should anyone? Honor had been used against her, but that did not mean honor was wrong. Only that the wicked had been cleverer than she. Having the sharpest blade, she quietly said, "That's not what honor is. It is defending the weak, it is doing the right thing. Even when it costs you." The fisher did not even turn her way. Then perish. It was not a test, Angharad Prediger then understood. It had never been. This was no tale of the fifth branch, where the clever princess moved the heart of the spirit with her honor. No play where her perseverance would be rewarded with the aid of an all-powerful ally, not even a song of cleverness and guile. The old monster she had made a pact with had wanted her to be a worse woman than she was, and now that she refused to be that monster would let her die. And the utter dismissal, the casual disinterest, was what burned her most. Because had the spirit not known who she was, when they made their pact? And now it shamed her for it, as if being anything but a selfish pit of despair was some sort of sin. "What did you choose me for, if not this?" Angharad snarled. "What else, if not honor?" Below the waters, one of the shadows bit the bait. It struggled after, scared and hurting and somehow knowing it was going to die. "I remember them shouting of it," the fisher said, "when the ships first landed on our shores." Arms like towers pulled, ripping out of the water a wriggling shape that Angharad's eyes shied away from. It was caught in a great palm, the barbed hook deftly slid out of shadowy flesh. "Honor, honor." The spirit laughed. They raised it a banner, bedecked their champions in it, painted it on the lips of their queens. The wriggling thing fought with terror's strength, but for all its efforts it did not slip the fisher's grasp. Angharad could not see the old spirit's face, but she knew it was smiling, just as she knew that part of her would have wept at the sight of it. The fisher's fingers squeezed, and after a wet and ugly crack the wriggling thing no longer wiggled at all. How sweet it made their screams taste, when my teeth cracked their bones. Angharad shivered as the spirit tossed the broken thing into the basket, where the dead flesh spread terror like poison in a cup. They loved their honor so much, your forebears, the fisher reminisced, that I nailed them to the young shore so they might sing of it on the wind for their coming kin to hear. O sleeping god, Angharad trembled. What have I done? There were so many the sea turned red, the spirit told her lovingly, that not even seagulls could drown out the screams. What had she sworn to free or die trying? Honor? The fisher said. I would not give wind for honor. I gifted you my sagacity, child, because you hate them. Because you fear them. And on the water before them Angharad saw scrawled the nightmare of the night where her life had been broken forever, the fire and the screams and the blood on the stone. Her breath caught in her throat and she did not deny the spirit's words for they were the truth. Angharad Tredegar would avenge her family. That oath she could not break, not without killing what was left of the girl who had been daughter of Rhiannon and Gwydion Tredegar. And if she killed that girl, what was even left? It has become half your name, the spirit said. You cannot renounce that, so the journey has become inevitable. The fisher slowly turned, and before her trembling gaze fled to the stones at her feet the Perduri glimpsed trails of ichor on grey flesh. There's poison in your veins, Angharad Tredegar, the fisher fondly said, and when you learn to drink of it, you will become a thing of dread. One fit to break the locks on my cage. And as Angharad looked down at her boots, she saw the mistake at last. Because the spirit had cut to the bone of her, but he had not done it without a price to himself, he had revealed of him as much as he stripped bare of her. I gave you my sagacity, the fisher had said. Nor merely a boon nor a sliver of power, but a part what he was. That was not a small thing, one without costs or one that could easily taken back. If she died, he would lose something, and not least of it what the spirit thought was a chance of someone capable of freeing him. Her gaze rose back to the water, finding once more Augusto Cerdon's feverishly triumphant gaze looking back at her. You need me, Angharad quietly said. There are others, the fisher said, and my nature is patient. But not wasteful, she said. You brought me here for a reason, fisher. To learn your answer, so that I might beat the eldest law. You do not want me to be dead for all that you cannot get me. You want me to be strong. For that is the only way you think I will ever be able to free you, she thought. Go on, then, Angharad Tredegar said, forcing herself to look at the face of horror. Show me your way. She saw nothing, only grey and shadow and ichor, yet still her eyes watered with tears. Then she smelled blood, felt it inside her mouth and sliding down her cheeks. She did not flinch or look away. The fisher laughed, a ship breaking on a reef, a shield wall shattering. I am no peddler god, child, the spirit said. I gave you a gift of blood and bone, which you have not learned to use. Did I give you eyes or my own sagacity? Then teach me, Angharad challenged. That is why you are here, the fisher said. You lessen yourself, clinging to your body like the shore. That is a child's fear. The great spirit's voice rang like a decree. Slay it, he said. Embrace the water. She watched the water before her, writ with light and a tale of treachery, and took a step beyond the shore. The water was cool, cold in a way that seeped into her bones, but she pressed on. A step after another, until it was swallowed whole and she opened her eyes. She stood beside Angharad Tredegar, whose expression was startled fury, and stepped away. Violence exploded, the cultists charging towards the shout and pinning the company down. Still surprised, the four behind the tree hesitated. Isabel took a crossbow bolt to the belly, falling with a scream, and Angharad Tredegar charged into the massive warriors. She would die, Angharad thought, it was only a matter of time. Bron tried to sink his hatchet in Augusto Cerdon's back, eyes shining with emotion, but Beatrice stopped him. She pulled at him and sung, face conflicted, said something to both. Angharad thought she would be able to hear, if she came closer, but she could not quite manage it. The three fled. Augusto struck across the face when he tried to go with them. He doubled it through the clearing even as Cosm was struck with a spear, and Raymond lost a hand to a sword blow. Cosm tried to run, but he was caught by one of the watchers and beaten unconscious. Angharad Tredegar killed 5 before Ocatlan broke her leg and Tupac rammed his spear through her heart. She died trying to claw at his throat one last time, but her bloody fingers fell short. Angharad's head broke the water, gasping. She felt a massive hand rest atop the crown of her head. "Do better," the fisher said, and forced her back under. This time, Angharad Tredegar began by pulling Isabel out of the way. She ran towards the other 4 and Cosmoflor took a crossbow bolt in the back halfway there. They all rushed into the clearing, sweeping over the 2 watchers like a tide, but the war band caught up with them before they reached the trees. 3 survived to run. Angharad Tredegar was not one of them. She sucked in a breath, emerging from the water. "Please," Angharad said. "I need," again, the fisher said, and pushed her back under. Angharad Tredegar charged the watchers herself, hoping the others would follow. She took a wound to a thrown knife, and Brun was shot in the arm, but they made it across the clearing before the war band caught up with them. She shouted an order and everyone scattered, as she did, running their own way towards the sanctuary road. 5 survived to flee. Angharad Tredegar's wound slowed her enough that Leander Galatas traced a sign before her and she hit a wall that could not be seen, falling down for a hollow to knock unconscious. The war band took her. "I'm drowning," Angharad gasped. "You can't dash," again, the fisher said. Angharad Tredegar ordered them so scatter before they had finished running across the clearing. 2 survived to flee. "I don't know how," she pleaded, mouthful of water and blood. "I can't dash." "Then try again," the fisher said. 9 more times she went under, until at last she found it. The loop in the hole, the winding path. And as the fisher's hand left her head, she fell to her knees in the shallows by the shore. Crawling as she coughed and wheezed, spitting out water tinted red. "It's too much," she got out. "It would have killed me. Without my hand, the poison will eat you from within," the fisher acknowledged. "But you have learned, and will learn. It is a beginning. It would never be like that again," Angharad grasped. No more chances by the dozen, only the poison pill she could swallow and hope not to die. But the fisher had not lied. She could do it, now. Step out of herself, beyond what she had thought the limits of her pact, that she could only have glimpses, and only through her own eyes. And that was yet a beginning in the old spirit's eyes. What kind of terrible gift had she bargained for? Sagging against the rocks, water still lapping at her legs, Angharad closed her eyes. Listening to her own breath, she could only think of how close she had come to drowning. Would she have become one of those wriggling things in the water, if she had? She stayed there on the shore, prostrated like one of the 4 bears the fisher had told her he had mutilated and tortured. But like all things out of the spirit's mouth, that had not been the story whole. "You weren't strong enough, in the end," Angharad said. "My forebears, they beat you. You lost the war." The fisher's gaze rested on her. "They bled me and bound me, Angharad Tredegar," the fisher said. "They stole half my name. But they could not end me, not for all their desperate bargains. So they buried me deep, where no one would find me." The spirit laughed, but it was the sound of teeth gnashing until they shattered, of a limb dipped in scalding water. They should have known better. Nothing is ever lost. She could feel the cold leaving her, the stillness fading. This place was about to end. "Yet you were wrong, Angharad Tredegar," the fisher said. And the last thing she heard before opening her eyes chilled her blood. "I have not lost the war, so long as I exist, it is yet to end." She grabbed Isabel by the sleeve, pulling her along. That way Raymond would not hesitate to follow. Angharad ran out from the cover of the tree, the taller of the cultist watchers palming a knife as the other charged with his spear. She released Isabel's sleeve, speeding forward, and at the last moment took a left. The thrown knife went wide, the other's spear came for her belly, but a pivot and a spin opened the charging hollow's throat. A heartbeat later Song shot the second watcher. Angharad turned, only for Isabel to gasp and even Master Cosm rocked back. "Your eyes," Isabel stammered. "There's so much blood." "Oh, was that why she felt so lightheaded? That was unfortunate." "Contract," she curtly said. "The three of you must run west, it's your best chance." "How do you?" Angharad brushed past Raymond, ignoring his question, and intercepted the last four as they rushed into the clearing with a slight delay. She needed to refine that, buy a little more time, but they would not listen if she asked. So instead she strode forward, past the haggard Bron and Beatrice, and rammed her fist in Augusto Cherdon's belly. He tried to block it, but he was slow and fearful, so he was on his knees and dry-retching in the heartbeat that followed. "Tredegar, now is not the time," Cosm called out, rushing towards them. "Good, that should do it." A glance back told her that Isabel and Raymond were already running towards the woods, as she had told them to. When Song caught up, for once looking disturbed, Angharad met her eyes. Song was always the one who listened when she gave an order, no matter the try. The noblewoman would prove worthy of that trust. "Take them by the eastern path," she said, gesturing at Bron and Beatrice. "You can't join up with the others, not yet." Song nodded, face tight. "I will wait for you at the end of the road," she said. "For as long as I can." "Sleeping God go with you," Angharad smiled, and walked past her. Now to find out if she had been clever enough. Cosm was helping up the traitor as the war band broke past the tree line, and in that moment she saw the dilemma on the face of the white-haired priest. The man could see a pair entering the trees near the western edge of the crag, 3 most of the way to the eastern path, and 3 still in the middle of the clearing. One of these was being helped up, and the one doing that was older than the runners. In the heartbeat that followed, the old cultist made the easy choice, barking out his orders. The war band would go for the 3 sacrifices they were certain to get, writing off the rest. The warriors came for them like a pack of wolves. "You've killed us all, you bitch," Augusto gasped out. "You, I will most certainly kill before this is done," Angharad agreed. "Let us find out for the rest." The elder Cherdon ran for it, as he had the last 2 glimpses, and Master Cosm followed him after hesitating for a heartbeat. Angharad instead tapped the flat of her sword against her shoulder, granting the war band an impeccable duelist salute and earning an absolutely delighted laugh from Tupac Sickle. Now, she thought, it was all over except the dance. She began backing away towards the east, the edge of the crag, and watched as the lead hollows hesitated. Most chose to pursue Augusto and Cosm, since she did not appear to be fleeing, including the remaining crossbowman, who'd had the gall to kill her thrice. By the time a party gathered to corner her with her back to the cliff, she was facing only 9 cultists and Tupac's crew. The rest were in pursuit, not yet knowing the effort was fruitless. "Surrender, child," the old hollow in robes told her. "You will not be harmed by our hand if you lay down your arms." "Come and take them, hollow," she replied, open in her disdain. The warriors, infuriated by her disrespect for what she still suspected to be some kind of priest, broke ranks to rush her. With that many headed her way, it should be that, and there it was. Tupac ordered his pack of traitors to hold back, going in alone. Getting her arm broken by that hammer once had been quite enough. O'Cotlin was remarkably quick for a man his size. Differences in height meant the hollows reached her as an uneven line, so Angharad slid into the gap. She stepped past the wild axe swing, cracking her saber down the man's back, and pivoted as the 2 hollows closest turned to converge on her. She lashed the first across the eyes before he could bring up his sword, ignoring his scream in favor of stepping out of a thrusting spear. She avoided the point, but the cultist was skilled enough to slap her shoulder with the haft, which hurt but more importantly slowed her. She was more tired than she had been in the glimpses. Her body did not move as quickly, and it was only getting worse. She stepped further away from the cliff, letting the warriors converge on her from all sides except the back, then when enough were committed she charged. The spears got in each other's way, needing too much space for how close the warriors were, and she ducked under a sword blow to hammer her shoulder into the hollow's chest. It hurt her more than him, He was wearing a breastplate, but he was knocked down and she stepped over him. Not quite quickly enough to avoid a cut in the back of her shoulder, just to the side of the bag still fastened there, but the axeman got a little too close and she hacked halfway through his wrist before dancing away towards the ledge, counting her steps so she would not fall over it. That had been a most embarrassing death. Two had been made unable to fight, a respectable beginning, but it would not last. Tupac had stayed out of it so far, watching her fight with smiling pale eyes, but when he struck it was the same way he always did. He waited until the hollows that had run into each other spread out into a half circle, this time the spearmen keeping careful distance from each other, and when they struck he slid past them, after tripping a spearman into her without batting an eye. She sliced open the spearman's throat without hesitation and kicked him back into Tupac, but the Aztlan was too quick. He danced around the corpse, his strange segmented spear finting for her throat and scoring a mark against her cheek when she was forced to parry. She saw the sword move from the corner of her eye and knelt, slicing through the back of the hollow's right knee and pushing him over the edge while he screamed. For now, she was near the right amount. The only trouble was that handling Tupac in a fight was like kissing a viper, a truth the Aztlan kept fresh by forcing her to throw herself to the side to avoid being impaled. She slashed at the closest hollow's ankles to force her to keep back, but Tupac smashed the middle of her back with the butt of his spear and she let out a hiss of pain. Rolling over she slashed his way, letting him dance back, and slash. The hollow rammed the spear through the back of her right knee, ripping a scream from her throat. Slash stepped to the right, letting out a scream as her veins burned. Her muscles spasmed, her heart beat wildly and Angharad thought that if she glimpsed even once more today her veins would fill with smoke. She had used the Fisher's gift all too much. The hollow that had almost impaled her took advantage of her span of weakness, striking her in the belly with the side of his spear, but Angharad took the hit and grabbed the shaft. Grunting with effort, feet spread wide, she forced the man into Tupac's path, who pushed him off the ledge without pause, and threw the spear in the legs of the hollow coming from her side. She needed space, just a little more space, to get to the right place. Gritting her teeth, she rushed the hollow she'd just thrown the spear at and hacked at his face. Only it was a hasty blow, awkwardly placed, and his parry caught it clean. It held her in place just long enough for another warrior to narrowly land a blow against her head, cutting through a brazen scalp before she rammed her saber through his wide-open guard and plunged it through his eye. Withdrawing, blood dripping down her face, she fled into the space she had made just as Tupac came for her. This was never a fight she was going to win, no matter how many times she tried, and if she even won too much of it the result would be her death. If they hated her too much, they would make sure she was dead. Just as her back foot slid past a trail of wildflowers, Angharad stepped closer to the ledge and parried Tupac's thrust. He redirected it to hit the side of her knee, but she came even closer to the edge and the Aztlan saw his opening. Pivoting so he was facing her with the cliff behind her, he twirled his spear. The trick had killed her, the first time he pulled it out. Now she could only hope she had read it right because everything depended on it. The first feint was at her right shoulder and she ignored it, preparing to catch the blow to her belly instead, that she made to parry, only to overextend it. The spearhead ripped up and down, through her bag and shallowly on the flesh beneath. Angharad fled the steel, stumbling back one step and then another, only to find herself leaning back at the very edge of the cliff. Tupac's eyes widened as she began to lose her balance, and the last thing she saw before toppling over the edge was the smile on his too perfect face while he gave her a textbook perfect duelist salute. She had exactly 2 heartbeats to live. The first was spent snatching the hook at the end of the rope, which she could not take out herself. They'd look for her. The bag had to be cut open so she could do it in time, and strike forward with it. Just in time for the iron hooks to sink deep into the dead tree just over the edge, her sweat-drenched fingers slipping as she desperately held on to the rope burning her hands. She smacked into the cliffside, not hard enough to fall but hard enough it jolted her spine and she had to swallow a scream of pain. Her arms burned but she held, no matter the pain she held. Below, clattering down against the rock, fell 2 things, the pack she no longer cared for and the saber her father had ordered made for her. She needed both hands for the rope. She had tried it. Surviving in honor had a price. The fisher had not lied about that. Folded onto the log, Angharad kept her mouth shut as one of the hollows came to have a look over the edge and cursed. He yelled something back at the others in a language she did not know, stepping away, and when Tupac came to have his look he said not a word. The one time she had killed 7, the cultists had hated her enough to look closely. They'd seen the hooks in the log and pushed it down with their spears. I told you she was not going to be one of the easy ones, Bishop Rolls, Tupac drawled in Antigua. You should have listened. You told me much, but I now question the worth of your word, a man replied in the same tongue, heavily accented. It was the old hollow's voice, she recognized, the one who she thought might be a priest. Bishop must be some kind of darkling title. Angharad held on tight to the rope, pressing herself against the cliff of the crag. Already her arms ached from having borne her entire weight and more during the fall, but to loosen her grip was to die. Sweat pricked against her palms, the rough hemp of the rope helping none, and she desperately looked for an outcropping to rest her feet on. This was the farthest she had ever got with foresight. Beyond this she was blind. How so? Tupac asked as he stepped away, sounding genuinely curious. We bargained for 4, Rolls coldly said. You have not delivered 4, leopard man. I promised you opportunities, Bishop, Tupac replied. Not birds in hand. If you could not catch as many as you wanted, that is your failure and not mine. Sleeping God, was she going to die here because her arms were too weak? There was nothing to hold on to, only a cliff rippling down to where her broken corpse would lie. Her boots slid against the stone and she fought down a rising panic, pulling herself up as she ignored the burn rising in her arms. That was when she saw it, not below her, but to the side. The skeletal dried remains of a bush, jutting out of the crag's side. It was to her left and she had to wiggle to the side of the stump, dread turning her limbs to lead, then pull herself up so she could rest her foot against the stump. It was higher and now her head was slightly over the edge, so. The dead bush gave, the old wood snapping, and she fell down half a foot as she bit down on a scream until her lip bled. She was slipping, her fingers clawing at stone, and though she still held the rope the hooks at the end of it had come half loose from the stump. She slammed her chin into the crag's ground, ignoring the pain as she tried to slow the slide. If she fell. Her boot hit the bottom of the bush, a part that did not give for it was wedged into stone, and her slide came to a halt. Angharad felt like weeping with relief, but she could not. Tough her face was half hidden by a clump of wildflowers. Through them she could see Tupac's sickle and his footpad standing with the war band of hollows. If she made too much noise, they would find out she still lived. So go pick up her corpse at the bottom of the cliff, Tupac dismissed. Do you expect me to roast the flesh and pour your wine as well, Rolls? The god cares nothing for the flesh of the dead, Bishop Rolls bit out. It is the living that make worthy sacrifices. If you expect resurrection of me, the Aslan drawled, I can only applaud your optimism, my friend. Lady Akanthi let out a snigger, then hid it behind a hand when the bishop turned to glare at her. More warriors had come through the woods, bringing their numbers up to 12, and that was a great many more than Tupac and his traders. Angharad saw the anger on their pale faces, the way they bristled at the disrespect their priest was being shown, and wondered what the Aslan's game was. Did he really think he could win if it came to a fight? 4 taken, 4 allowed through, Rolls insisted. If you do not live up to your end of the bargain, why should we? The largest of the 2 Aslan, Ocotlan, leaned forward with an ugly grin as he hefted his large hammer over his shoulder. You don't want anything to do with that scrap, Hollow, he said. Believe me. One of the Hollows, wearing a shirt of iron mail, spat to the side and came to stand by his priest with his hand on his sword. Let us fight them, Lord, he said. We will take them all to the temple, I swear it. Their disrespect demands punishment. Tupac's footpads stirred in unease, for the Hollows were reaching for their arms. Swords and spears and axes, even 2 crossbows. However skilled a warrior, numbers were not something easily challenged. He won't do that, the eerie Aslan smiled, raising his right wrist. Will you, Bishop. On it was small bracelet of beads, black stones sculpted in the Aztlan style. Angharaide's gaze dipped to Bishop Rolls, who was rubbing an identical bracelet worn on his left wrist. The old hollow's face was considering, and after pulling away from the bracelet he tugged at his white beard. "I think," Bishop Rolls slowly said, "that too is not enough. That you are short enough of the oath that I will be afforded enough room." Tupac's face was a smiling mask, but some with him were easier to read. "He might be right," Leander Galatas nervously said. "If he tries to take us prisoner instead of kill us, he might not forfeit his heart." His leader, the traitor of traitors, eyed him with dislike. A glance was enough to have the gaunt man flinching back, reaching for the arm he'd lost on the blue belt before proving himself a man without honor. "You would take such a risk out of petty spite?" Tupac lightly said. "I do not think you so careless, Rolls." "Two," the bishop flatly repeated, "is not enough. I already took a risk on this bargain, leopard man. I will not return to my god with such petty offerings." "That is troubling," Tupac replied. He hummed, prowling back and forth like the great cat after which his society had been named. His gaze swept around, thoughtful, and for a terrifying heartbeat Angharade thought he had seen her through the flowers. But his gaze moved on and lingered on the hollows, as if measuring them, before he let out a sigh. "Very well," he said, and struck Leander Galatas in the belly. The sailor gasped in pain, bending forward, and before he could so much as trace a sign the Aztlan grabbed him by the head and smashed it into his knee. Galatas dropped to the ground in a sprawl, bloody-faced and unconscious. Tupac took a step back, ignoring the horrified look at Kainthi foes was shooting him just as much as O'Cutlan's mocking chuckle. 3 for 3, then, Tupac offered the bishop. "That should sature God in our terms both." Bishop Rolls laughed. "A true son of the Radiance," he said. "Not a speck of loyalty in you." Tupac arched a two-prefect brow, as if to ask him to get on with it. "The bargain holds," Rolls conceded. "You may reach the sanctuary under blessing of peace." Neither side was eager to remain after that, the cultists taking their wounded and their fresh sacrifice before heading south. The search for Cosme and Augusto, she saw, had been called off. The warriors that had gone after them returned empty-handed, following their brethren south. Tupac and his remaining helpers began heading north after they went, towards the road that would lead to Sanctuary. Only the Aztlan begged off, leaving immediately, telling them to go ahead, and he headed towards the edge of the cliff the moment they entered the woods. Panic rising, Angharade lowered herself past the edge of the cliff. Even if she fought him and win, the noise was sure to bring back hollows. If he found her, she was dead. Not even 10 heartbeats later, pale eyes looked down at her from over the ledge, taking in her situation with nothing but amusement. "I told you," Tupac sickled conversationally said, "that you would regret not coming with me." "Damn you," Angharade hissed. "Damn you for this and for all." The Aztlan reached down, pressing the butt of his spear against her forehead, and she swallowed her anger. Drops of cold sweat ran down her back. All he needed to do was push, and down she went. "That's better," Tupac smiled. He suddenly burst forward, and though it took all she had, Angharade did not allow herself to flinch. And that was all he'd sought, she realized a heartbeat later. For her to flinch, the spear had not moved so much as a hair's breadth. Those unnatural pale eyes had watched her all the while, and finally the Aztlan nodded. "You are a delight," Tupac Sickle said with satisfaction, drawing back. "I look forward to working with you in the second trial, Lady Tredegar." The spear withdrew and the monster offered her a salute with it. "Until then, a good day to you." And just like that, he left. From her sight first, then disappearing into the woods where the others had gone. Angharade, breathing shallow, dragged herself over the edge. There she lay in the dirt, sweaty and bloody and caked in filth. Her body burned, but not half as much as the indignation in her belly. Swallowing the scream in her throat, Angharade Tredegar pushed herself up to her feet and began her walk to the Trial of Ruins. Chapter 17. Tristan, sitting on a stone, idly strummed at strings that did not exist. The supplicant's cithara in his hands was but a petrified piece of wood without the additional accessory of a priest with mastery of the gloam to weave strings and pluck at them. The first might not be so impossible, but the second was rather more of a hurdle. So, in the hours past midnight but before they left, Tristan asked a burning question. "Can you play Cithara?" Sarah eyed him like he'd track mud all over her nice easy carpet. "Can you dance the Moravik?" She shot back. The thief duly considered this. "I've never tried," he said. "There's your answer," Sarah easily replied. He supposed it would have been too lucky for one of them to be able to play the ancient magical instrument he'd dug up from the shrine. As expected, he would have to scrap it for parts. Tristan would have liked to keep the Cithara for the rest of the trials, but its belly full of feathers would do the trick instead, if only the once. Sarah's blue eyes remained on him, scrutinizing. "You're scheming again," she noted. "I would never," Tristan lied. "We're not betraying Firanda," Sarah reminded him. "She's lovely and her relationship with Sonali is very romantic." He blinked at her in surprise. "Her what?" he repeated. "Tristan," Sarah patiently said, "they have 2 bedrolls but only one gets mussed. Either one of them sleeps on stone or they're fucking." He had actually thought Sonali was being very neat. "They don't act like it," he said. Tristan himself might not partake, but he had learned to recognize the signs of people being lovers. He had caught on that things between the pair were not quite as simple as mistress and hired hand, but he'd not seen any telltale marks of there being a physical dalliance. "They are probably used to being discreet," she shrugged. "She's a noble, right? I imagine her family would disapprove." "They likely don't know," Tristan frowned. The way that Sonali was not a corpse floating by Fisherman's Quay was something of an indication. The thief could not remember ever hearing House Vilazar before, but the other in fan zones had treated Firanda as one of them, so she should not be an imposter. It must be one of the lesser houses, those barely above merchant households and means. The kind that needs to marry its children well to keep the lamps lit, he thought. He thought he might have an inkling of what Firanda Vilazar was after by coming to the dominion of lost things, and thus was forced into the unpleasant experience of feeling the barest kernel of respect for an infanzona. This island truly was full of trials. "I'll be keeping faith," Tristan told his companion, returning to the thread. "I am only considering the ways our efforts might turn sour." "We are taking risks," Sarah acknowledged. "But there is no way forward without doing so." The lay of their plan was simple enough. Young and Firanda had found cultists encamped in the woods to the east of the bridge and killed a fox on the way back. Their company was to approach the camp while the hollows slept, then Tristan would stuff the fox carcass with every drop of lodestone extract he had left. One of the 3 among them that did not bumble in the woods would plant the carcass in the cultist camp, at which point their group would begin a circuitous route west while waiting for the Heliodorn beast to attack the hollows. With both their obstacles keeping each other busy, they were then to run for the bridge in relative safety and hope the great Lemure did not finish the cultists off before they could cross. It was going to blow up in their faces. If someone asked him why he was so sure of that, Tristan would have struggled to answer, but within the enclosure of his own mind it seemed obvious. It was in the moving parts, the hitch of the clock, the ringing of the coin as it spun up. Debacle was in the air. Too much neatness was being relied on, and if years with Fortunas had taught Tristan the Brascal anything, it was how to sniff out a coming debacle. Now, the clever thing would be to find his way out and prepare for when firmament dropped on their heads, ensure, by hook or crook, that he was not the one of the lost. But the thief gotten greedy since he sailed to the Dominion. Too used to the shelter of companions that would not easily betray him, to others keeping their word and expecting is to be kept. To all the comforts that were a slow poison, dulling your edge and lulling your eyes into closing. Never grow roots, Abuela had taught him. Trees are good only for felling. Hard as the lesson had been to live up to, it had also kept him alive. How many times had he crossed a slumlord or a gang only for their swaggering bullies to find he was a ghost? No home, no haunts, no ties. No man could take revenge on Morning Mist. Tristan had not forgot the methods through which he had stayed alive so long, how in his own way he'd come to thrive, a fatter rat than most, but still he found his mind spinning out the wrong plans. Tacking on demands, like keeping Sung and Sarah alive. Vanessa as well, The thought crept in, but bit down on it. If he opened the door to the old woman, then Franco would not be far behind, and soon he would like a miner out of the trenches, back breaking for the weight of the stones he carried. When it comes tumbling down, and it will, come find me, Tristan said. I may be able to keep us alive. The Heliodorn beast was clever, for a lemur, not the kind of creature that would eat poison if it could smell it. And it so happened that Tristan had a Sithara's worth of something the beast would want to avoid. If he stretched them thin, there might be feathers enough for 3. Traipsing through the woods was significantly more unpleasant when they were wet. It had rained while young and Ferranda went looking for the cultists and gods, but he wished it had been long enough since for the forest to dry. Vanessa thrice tripped on a slippery route she misjudged the distance of before he asked Ains to stay with her. Felix kept shivering from the cold. A fresh lick of dust courtesy of Lan had perked him up but also made him feverish, and with the rain washing off many of the marks Ferranda had left, they'd got lost for half an hour. Sonali took the lead in her place, effectively trailblazing, which slowed them down further. They advanced with the lanterns veiled until only the barest slice of light showed, a procession trying to be quiet but falling short of success. At least no one was chatting. With Sarre ahead of him and Franco behind, the thief had much room to move, and so he was left alone with his thoughts. It was not a blessing. With only himself for a company, they kept going in increasingly grim circles. Perhaps it was his discomfort with the woods, or simply the way the darkness seemed like it kept closing in from all sides, but part of him could not help but feel they were walking to their deaths. As if they had all missed a knife with their names written on the blade. The same instincts that had guided him in Sacramonte insisted he was making a mistake, and it frustrated him not to know if it was unease talking or if he should be listening. "You look like you're chewing on a lemon," Fortuna told him. "I feel as if I am pulling a noose around my neck," Tristan muttered back. "How else should I look?" Pondering this, the goddess mimicked pulling at a rope above her head and rolled her eyes before lolling out her tongue. "More like chiss," she informed him. It was one of the keenest comforts of Tristan's life that other people could not see Fortuna. And to think some scholars insisted gods were fonts of wisdoms, that their words could open up fresh realms of understanding. Still, his lips twitched. Any moment now, the golden-haired goddess, still taunting him with rolled-up eyes, walked backwards straight into a tree. This did not actually hurt her in any way, but as tended to be the way when she ran into things without noticing, Fortuna emerged on the other side glaring at the tree as if she had been personally attacked. However grim the situation, watching the Lady of Long Odds begin yet another implacable blood feud with an inanimate object did wonders for his mood. She'd once spent an entire month trying to talk him into tearing down a worn statue of Emperor Per after passing through it mid-sentence. Tristan, naturally, had instead paid the matron of the house across the street to thoroughly clean it. Best 9 redises he'd ever spent. Ducking under a low branch, the thief followed the sight of Sarah's back. She had cut away at her skirts since her face was revealed, making slits so they could more easily be running, and taken off her gloves. She still carried only a knife for weapon, but what did she need blades and powder when she could call on the powers of the gloam? The thief bit his lip, hard enough he almost drew blood. He was still tired from running through last night, despite the rest since, and their pace through the woods was slow enough it was not the first time he had caught his mind beginning to wander to nowhere. He'd be of no use to anyone, not even himself, if the cultists got the drop on him. And the cult of the Red Eye was certain to have watchers. The war band had raised its camp far from where their group had encountered the Airvetan, but there was always a risk. It would have been madness not to keep a full watch with the likes of a Heliodorn beast prowling the woods. The darkling camp Young and Ferranda had found was about an hour to the east of the bridge, in the woods facing the tall grass. It was by the river, which, this far east, was at the bottom of a wide ravine. The way the pair told it, they had found the hollows half by chance. It had begun to rain violently while they were out, and during the storm part of the cliff the cultists had made their camp broke off and collapsed into the ravine. If not for the ruckus that had made, the pair might have missed the darklings entirely, for their camp was well hidden behind a tall thicket of trees and broken ring of raised stones. Sarre slowed in front of him, then weaved behind a tree. Following quietly, Tristan found that in the small clearing before him, little more than a dozen feet of room between trees, all wet earth and stinking dead leaves, most of their party had stopped. The two who had been leading them, Yang and Sonali, must have called a halt. He joined them to find out why. The informal circle that had formed to make decisions assembling in short order, Firanda and Sonali, he and Yang and Sare. And Lan, who instead of chasing away he made eye contact with. The blue-lipped Tianxi met his gaze and dipped her head in acknowledgement of the debt he could force to leave but had not, and he looked away to find Sare's lips twitching as she made no pretense she had not been watching them. As tended to be the way with her, he was left feeling wretchedly bare. "We are close to the camp," Yang told them. "No more than half an hour at our current pace." "We were supposed to get closer still," Firanda Vilazar said. "Why stop now?" Tristan forced himself not to look at Vanessa, who had been lagging behind even with A's help. It was close to morning now, as they'd left only after everyone grabbed a few hours of sleep in anticipation of the early start, but at her age that made little difference. It won't be about her, besides, he thought. Yang had never been shy about his belief that if the gray hairs could not keep up they should be left behind. "I found tracks," Sonali said. "From your tone," Sare slowly said, "they are not ours from earlier." He shook his head. "Fresh. There should not be anyone from the Bluebell left around here," Lan noted. "That leaves only hollows." "Or the watch," Tristan thought, "but they should not be involving themselves in the trial of lines." "At least 10, Sonali said, "but they are good. Could be more. All moving east, quiet but quick." "If they were friends to the war band in the camp," the thief said, "they should have no reason to be sneaking around." "They could be hiding from the Airvetin," Sare suggested. "This far east?" Yang said. "If it were anywhere near here it should have already found the camp. They must be hiding from the other hollows." Tristan did not disagree. The beast had last been seen hours to the west and it had no reason to push this far east save the hollow camp, which would already be as a graveyard, if the Airvetin had caught scent of it. "That complicates things," Firanda Vilazar grimaced. "We don't want to be caught in the middle of a cult war. If we let them get into a scrap first, it will be easier to plant the carcass," Tristan pragmatically said. "We don't know if they will fight," Yang said. "They could band together. And even if they do, it might not be anytime soon." It was early morning still, before the dawning hour where most of Sacramonte woke, so Tristan would admit it was a toss-up. There was no telling whether this fresh war band would want to press on to strike while the other hollows were asleep or rest instead. "We must track them and find out," Firanda said. "It would be dangerous to try the cultist camp before we know we won't be attacked from behind," Sare agreed. So did Tristan, as it happened, and the rest of them. Firanda and Sonali were the ones who headed out into the woods, the rest of their company waiting in the clearing and huddling for warmth until the pair returned with news. The thief lowered himself to the ground and rested his back against a tree, closing his eyes to enjoy the break, though not so much he ever ceased listening to the noises around him. All this talk of ambushes had his nerves thin. Before long he heard someone heading his way, though what he found when he opened his eyes surprised him. Franco, hand smoothing back what few wisps of white hair remained atop his head, came to plop himself down by his side. The old professor held his flat cap tucked under the arm of his worn green coat, pulled tight enough around his neck that only the collar of his cotton shirt showed. His boots were of good make and obviously new, but his breeches were laborer's clothes in dull brown whose seams were beginning to give. He was dressed, Tristan thought, like a man who had raided his wardrobe for clothes he thought fitting for the countryside and put them out without thought to what fit and not. "You bought the boots just for the Dominion, didn't you?" That was telling, the thief thought. Franco, unlike Vanessa, still had an eye to living through this. The toothless old man let out a sigh when he rested his back against the tree, fruitlessly trying to pull his coat even tighter. "Try to gather your strength," Tristan advised. "This is the last breath before the plunge." "So I've gathered," Franco agreed. "It has been an interesting few days, Tristan." I have seen things I never thought I might. That temple was stripped clean, the thief nearly said. Is a single supplicant so thorough enough to please you so? I went treasure hunting when I was a youth, so empty temples are old hand to me, the old man chuckled. 3 expeditions in the Isles of Nem, though our captains were so careful boulder hunters had already emptied the ruins. The thief hid his surprise. The Isles of Nem were famous in Sacramonte. Treasure hunters had been sailing there for decades yet were said to have found no more than a third of the islands. Many of them could only be reached if their name was known, some ancient antediluvian other machine otherwise keeping them hidden. Once every decade or so, when a new name was dug up by scholars, every treasure cruise south of Ixion's lighthouse competed to be the first to plunder the depths. The stories Tristan heard made it plain the crews were as dangerous to each other as the dead gods and the traps, not at all the kind of place he imagined a man who taught at the University of Rev might go. What was it that surprised you, then? He asked. The old man paused for a moment. That young girl on the ship, he said. I never caught her name. Tristan's belly clenched. There was only one he could be meaning. Marcella, he said. Her name was Marcella. Franco sighed, which sent him to coughing into his hand. The cough never got worse, but neither did ever seem to go away, which had left the thief to wonder whether it was from the depredations of old age or from a contract's price. A tragedy, Franco said. It always is, when a god takes one of us, but I had never thought to see a saint with my own eyes. I could do without seeing it again, Tristan said. Oh, Franco softly said, I agree. A hesitant pause. Have you read what Alicia Archer wrote on the 3 modes of the divine? Franco asked. Tristan cocked an eyebrow. As a matter of fact, he had. Abuela had obtained for him the extract of the work being referred to, The Sea of Shapes, concerning the subject. He had been interested enough to track down a complete copy afterwards. He had even set aside his distaste for the family name involved. The Arca were one of the 6, the infanzones of infanzones, and paid proper coin for it. Stealing from those who peddled witch books was a fool's bargain. Perception, dislocation and manifestation, Tristan quoted. These were the 3 modes through which gods interacted with the material, according to Lady Archer. Perception, for God to make themselves seen to a mortal, was the most basic. Even the most destitute of deities could do it, and it was the limit of Fortuna's own power. Gods who were still little more than shapes in the ether first brushed against Vesper this way, reaching through places or times matched to their nature. Tristan himself had met Fortuna at his lowest, hiding in a shattered shrine with no way to live save beating long odds. Dislocation was the act through which a god brought a mortal into themselves, a connection of souls that could not be done without an existing bridge, usually a contract. It was an experience supposedly much like a vision, the world around you grinding to a halt until the god released their hold. Even that was a trick of perception, however, for no god was powerful enough to halt the march of Vesper. It was only by bringing a soul into themselves that could cheat and make a single heartbeat seem an hour. The last was manifestation, what all gods relentlessly sought, to become physical, ether manifest. In Lady Archer's words, to overcome entropy, existence becoming less effort than absence. It could only be achieved through mortals, by contracts, sacrifice and prayer. The Manes, those old gods who were patrons to the infanzones, were said to have walked the world since before the fall of Liergan. Not all need be so old, forever. The old Alcazar, the broken fortress at the heart of Sacramonte-turned-temple district, was full of temples and shrines to gods manifest. It wasn't only the nobles that saw divinity in the flesh either. Even the merc had a few, though only fools bargained with gods who chose to make their home among squalor and desperation. Lady Alicia's works have long been of interest to the university, Franco said. The Archer now jealously hoard their secrets, so it has been the work of generations to expand on the original postulations. Tristan was not surprised at the secrecy. The Archer were famous for being able to forge legacy contracts, bargains with gods that were passed down the bloodline. They sold that expertise for riches and favors, and whether you were of the most splendid of infanzones or the lowest of ruts, no one liked to share their begging bowl. I was once friends with the Master of Etheric Studies, Tristan, Francho continued with forced nonchalance, and she told me of an experiment made on the nature of sainthood. Did she? Tristan frowned, grown wary of the conversation. He could not grasp where the old professor was headed, and it raised his hackles. This was not idle conversation, he could tell that much. The question to be resolved was as follows: does one absolutely need to draw on a contract for the process of sainthood to begin, or is continued exposition to the lesser modes, perception and dislocation, enough on its own? The thief stilled. So that was what this conversation was about. He met the man's dark eyes. "You heard me talking," he said. Francho coughed, the sound of wet as the saliva flicking his lips. "I saw your lips move," he said. "And once I thought of it, it is not so hard to put together. How often did I see you looking at something in the dark or muttering to yourself?" I had though a nervous habit. Fortuna leaned against the tree, cocking an eyebrow as her red dress trailed in the muck and leaves. "I thought it would be Sar-A that caught us," the goddess admitted. "Interesting." Tristan forced himself not to look. It was more habit than need, for already he knew that denial was not on the table. "I am not in danger of sainthood," Tristan replied in a murmur. "There is no need to worry." He would have preferred to dismiss the professor entirely, but that would be unwise. If Francho took this to the others out of fear, the thief might well be cast out of their company. No one would want to take a risk with a saint. The old man grimaced. "I understand your God may be assuring you of that," the old professor gently said, "but perception is not meant to last so long. I imagine it began when you made your contract. How long have you been continuously seeing them? A week, a month?" "The danger now grows by the hour." Fortuna laughed. He kept his face blank. "Pretend," the thief slowly said, "that it has been a year." "Or 10, the goddess added. Francho peered at him dubiously. "That is," he began, then stopped. "You are serious?" "I am." "Your god should be dead," the scholar said. "Perception takes power, and the god does not devour you at the end, then it is frittering itself away for nothing. Once it has spent itself, its consciousness will fade back into the ether." The thief licked up a glance at Fortuna, who looked as baffled as he felt. "It feels more natural to be with you than not," the goddess told him. "Tell the idiot I have not grown weaker." "It says it has not faded since starting," Tristan duly repeated. Fortuna, scowling, began reaching for his hair as if threatening to pull at it. He hastily revealed. "She says." "It," Fortuna repeated in disgust. "You calamitous brat, how dare you deny my beauty for even an instant?" "Poets wept at my leaving, Tristan, they fucking wept." Alas, they had company, so he could ask her whether she was sure they had not been weeping until she left. Francho's eyes were wide and alight. "Fascinating," the old professor murmured. "The study of gods is the study of exceptions, so the cry of impossibility is that of a fool, but never have I seen our understanding of the modes so contradicted. Your goddess must be extraordinary." A heartbeat passed. "I've changed my mind," Fortuna announced, preening against the tree. "He is obviously a man of piercing insight." Tristan supposed it was senseless to call flattery a weakness when the lady of long odds was made up mostly of those in the first place. Describing her by her strengths would be like describing a sinking ship by how well its sails could catch the wind, not untrue but rather missing the point. "A discussion for another time," Tristan calmly replied, quite possibly meaning never. "I hope your concerns were set to rest." The scholar looked puzzled, for a moment, and only then remembered how their conversation had begun. He coughed in embarrassment. "Yes, naturally, of course," Francho hurriedly said. "I did not mean to pry into your affairs, my boy. It was only worry." "I understand," Tristan said, and in truth he did. He had not enjoyed the polite interrogation, for that was what their talk had been, but he might well have done the same in the other man's shoes. The professor still felt guilty, however, it was plain on his face. In practice he had asked of Tristan's contract, which was the kind of thing some people pulled knives over. The guilt made the man babble, seeking to fill the silence. After a few aborted attempts at idle talk he fell back on safer grounds. I have been listening to old stones, Francho said. The raised ring of stones where Young and Lady Vilazar found the hollow camp. You might be interested to hear it is only one of many. Tristan cocked an eyebrow. I am, he admitted. There are others. I am not sure of the number, but there will be others along the length of the river splitting the island, the professor said. More interesting yet, I believe them built by the same people who raised the shrine where we found Lady Vilazar. The cultists care not for them, save as building materials. So what were they for? He asked. They do not look like shrines. I cannot tell, Francho enthusiastically said. Some voices speak of ritual killing, but that may be the work of the Red Eye. It can be hard to tell the when and who of what I hear. I find intriguing, however, that they were raised along the river. Many cultures saw running water as a metaphysical boundary. The rings could be meant to strengthen or weaken it. They chatted for a while still in low voices, Tristan keeping the talk going in part to distract from their earlier one. Twice he raised his voice when speaking of the stones when someone was close, the second time when it was Lan. That should throw them off the tracks of the earlier conversation. The talk was long done by the time Feranda and Sonali returned. Their faces were grim. The news were not good. We did not find them, the Milani bluntly said. The man's directness was starting to grow on him. It had a certain charm to it. The trail cut off after a field of gravel, Feranda added. There is no telling if they are still around. Tristan took off his hat, which was doing a delightful job of keeping dripping water off his scalp, a testament to the occasional Milani stroke of brilliance, and passed a hand through his hair. We need to plant the bait on the cultists anyway, he said. If we wait too long they'll break camp and our plan is good as finished. None of them liked the additional risk, but what choice did they have? It was simple but careful work, stuffing the dead fox with lodestone extract. Lady Vilazar had caught the animal in the back with a throwing knife, one he had never seen her use, caution he could only approve of, so he had to widen the wound a bit before inserting the substance. He made sure to wash his hands careful with alcohol after. There was less of it left than he would have liked. Careful not to get any on you, he warned. Lady Feranda silently nodded. She and Yang were the ones to set out for the cultist camp again, leaving the rest of them to wait in that same clearing. There was no point in finding a better hiding place when the trees and stones here would serve fine. Tristan helped a tired Vanessa to fold her legs beneath a jutting rock, tucked away out of sight. The bandage around her eye was red again, he saw with a grimace. But he only had one roll of makeshift bandages left and this would keep for a while still, so he did not make the offer. We are almost through, Tristan told her. Once we cross the bridge it should be a clear path to the second trial. It would be senseless for cultists to wait in ambush past the bridge when the bridge was already being guarded. He could not be sure, of course, but he doubted there would be much trouble on the last stretch of the journey. Vanessa wanly smiled. My legs won't give yet, don't worry, she said. It is these cursed roots that are never where they should be. Once we're sure the beast is on the hollows, we'll open the lanterns wide, he told her. It will be easier to move for us all. Sonali had done the rounds while he busied himself with the old woman, nudging the few lacking in prudence to find better places, and now there were only the two of them left. The huntsman took him aside. Tristan had never gotten so close a look at the beadworks on the man's cloak and shirt before. They were all sharp angles and deep colors, though nothing so bright it would stand out in the woods. The thief had heard that all the clothes adorned with the same that were sold in Sacramonte were fakes, for beadwork was particular to the northern Low Isle and the colored patterns particular to family clans of that storm-racked land. The other man saw it and held his gaze. The beast might catch us, Sonali grunted. Tristan's brow rose. It is a risk, he cautiously agreed. If it do, the huntsman says, and you betray us, I will shoot you first. The thief's eyes narrowed. That sounds like a threat, he said. Sonali said, sounding pleased at his quick understanding. So don't. Fucking fan zones, but not Feranda. I thought it was the very opposite, with you two, he dryly replied. The Milani frowned, confusion pulling at his scarred cheeks. little smooth stripes Tristan had never noticed before, none thicker than a razor blade. The man's Antigua might not be good enough for wordplay, the thief eventually admitted. You and her, he said instead. Sonali's face brightened with understanding and he nodded. Yes, he said. She is not like the others. So don't betray, or I'll kill you. Well, that did have the benefit of being impeccably straightforward. The nuances to get lost in. I won't, Tristan assured him. The Milani eyed him for a while, then slowly nodded. She thinks Sarah runs you, Sonali said. But I don't. You're more like Umbini. A word in Amoya, Tristan thought, but not one he recognized. We're allies, he shrugged. We should be too, the huntsman bluntly said. Better you than Infanzones. All snakes. Against his better judgment, the thief's lips twitched. One of your own nobles went with them, he pointed out. Tredigger. Sonali snorted. Piers, he said, like it explained everything. When he saw it did not, the huntsman continued. Half are mad, Sonali explained, the other acted. It had the of an old saying to it, which made it all the more amusing to hear. Not a great admirer of nobles, I take it, Tristan grinned. My uncles shoot their taxmen when they come to the hold, the huntsman proudly said. Outlaw under 3 different names. It was making an increasing amount of sense to the thief how Sonali got along so well with Young, a man who referred to nobles by a word which meant relic. Yours are a forward-thinking folk, Sonali, Tristan told him. Would that we were all so wise. The Milani eyed him, as if trying to ascertain if he was being made sport of, then nodded decisively. The trial of ruins needs allies, the huntsman stated. The weak get sold out. Think on it. Tristan found, to his surprise, that he was considering it. He was yet hesitant to tie himself too closely to anyone. The more interest he had to care for, the harder it would be to get a good shot at Cosmoflor, but he could do worse for allies than despair. They were competent, and while he did not trust Vilazar in the slightest, he was fairly sure that if Sonali ever intended to turn on him, the knife would come from the front and not the back. The huntsman offered him a polite nod, which he returned, and then Sonali went to cut off the last lantern entirely. There were plenty of roots and stones to hide under, but after staying so long in the same clearing, Tristan was feeling restless. The brush of wind against the leaves above had him reaching for his knife, what he thought to be a bird only a shivering branch, but the idea it brought to mind pleased him. It took a minute or two to find a halfway dry tree with branches low enough he could hoist himself up, but find it he did. The bark bit at his fingers as he climbed, but the work was not arduous, and once crouched on the lowest branch he found another in reach. He'd be able to get higher with little effort. Once he began rising, he continued on a whim, the thought of breaking past the canopy of this damnable forest too pleasing to resist. In a matter of minutes he broke past the leaves, face emerging for his first clear look at the sky since he'd entered the forest. The stars shone pale in the distance, their light just enough to outline the sea of trees spread out below. When squinting he could almost make out where the tree line ended to the north, the ravine where the river ran. The bridge was too far to make out. Breathing in slowly, the thief let tension bleed out of his frame. It was not in his hands whether Young and the Infanzone would succeed. All he could do was wait. Until then, he might as well take in the rare sight of a wild forest that was that mist. For 3 seconds Tristan leaned forward, heart beating against his ears, and prayed to any god listening it was just some fog from the rain he saw. But it was too thick, moved too quickly. The Heliodorine beast. It's coming. It was too close for the lodestone extract to be responsible. Sonali had said the lemure saw smells as colors, but while her beacon of color had just been lit, the monster was more than halfway to the camp already. It had already been close, but why? The thief struggled to understand where it had gone wrong, until finally he found the keystone. Sonali had said the tracks he'd found earlier were heading east, but perhaps it might have been more accurate to say they were heading away from the west. It was after them, he muttered. Fuck. Sarah had been right. The cultists hadn't been going east because they were looking for a fight with the other hollows. They were running away from the Heliodorine beast. And Tristan figured they might well have lost it, because there had been no sign of the monster. Only now most of a bottle's worth of lodestone was wafting up like a column of smoke. It was like waving a red flag before a bull. Cursing under his breath, he got moving, branch after branch, until he could leap down into the leaves. Vanessa peeked out from under her stone. "Tristan?" she called out. "Trouble," he replied. "Sonali, the beast is already close." The Milani huntsman stepped out of the shadow between trees like he'd just manifested out of thin air, grim face gone grimmer. "I'll fetch them, then we run," he said. The addition of Young to them was likely more than just politeness, considering how well the pair got along. Tristan shook his head. "I'll go," the thief said instead. The man looked about to object, so he raised his hand to cut him off. "If the people here have to run, I can't guide them," he said. "You can. I'll be enough to play messenger, Sonali." Reluctantly, the Milani nodded. He gave few curt instructions as to the path to follow, which Tristan carefully committed to memory, and without further ceremony he went. It would have been a lie to say that Tristan moved smoothly or skillfully. He almost ripped his knee up sliding down a flat stone and used the wrong lightning-struck tree as a signpost, forcing him to double back and take a left past the running water. But he got there, and though it came at the cost of some scuffing and spitting out a mouthful of dead leaves, he got to the outskirts of the cultist camp. Creeping across the wet earth, he risked a look, finding a few fires lit from behind the broken ring of raised stones, of which barely half were left. The trees were thick here, so close every path needed squeezing through, but that worked in his favor for now. It would be difficult to pick him out even for a darkling. From what he could tell, the cultists were not yet awake, save for the watchers, two of which were perched atop raised stones. Now he needed to find out if Yang and Fernando were still around, dearly hoping they hadn't just walked past each other in the dark. When a gloved hand covered his mouth, pulling him back, he moved without thought. Elbow in the stomach, pivot, opposite elbow in the neck, while he reached for his knife. There was a grunt behind him and he turned to see Fernando Velazar clutching her head as she stumbled back. She was groaning in pain. Behind her, Yang moved out from behind an oak's trunk. "You should have whistled," the Tiangsi murmured. "I can see that now." "Yes," the Infan's owner rasped out. "You're lucky I looked before using the knife," Tristan told her, unsympathetic. Tempted as he was to rub salt in the noble's wound, there were more pressing matters. "The Erevatin is close," he said. "Where is the bait?" In the dark it was hard to make out their expressions, but there was no missing how they both stiffened. Neither were fool enough to think anything but death awaited if the beast caught them. "In a berry bush close to the edge of their camp," Fernando replied. "How close, Tristan?" "I can't be sure now, but when I left..." He never finished the sentence. Not for lack of trying, but because at his feet mist was billowing out. The thickness of the growth had played against him, let him miss the creeping advance until it was too late. The Erevatin was here, and where its mist spread there was only silence. A shiver of dread went down his spine. If it had found them. But from the corner of his eye he saw movement near the edge of the cultist camp. In the trembling light of the fires a hulking shape approached, tearing through the trees in eerie silence. Gods, but it was so quick for a creature so large. It almost seemed delicate, the way it moved, until you saw the crushing weight it bore down on all it touched. Panicking hollows tried to wake their fellows without being able to scream in alarm, but it was too late. The great beast slowed only for a moment, when it reached the edge of the ring of raised stones. Tentacles carefully felt out the edge of them, and after finding what they wanted the beast burst through. Someone pulled at his arm, and Tristan did not fight back. They ran, leaving the cultists to their death. The way back was faster than when he'd come alone, but not fast enough. They could not run as quick as Tristan felt the need to, heart racing in fear. It was dark and slippery, and none of them had brought a lantern. It had been too risky. He followed Young's back as best he could, tried to walk where the man walked, and only slipped the once. Neither of the others stopped for him when he did. Tristan was not angered by it, could not be when a primal terror pressed against his own back. As soon as they found the others, he thought, they must all run. The plan was not yet undone, only on the razor's edge. They had been meant to already be getting closer to the bridge when the Heliodorn beast attacked the cultist camp, but this was not beyond salvaging. If the Erevaton took its time with the hollows, they might still get across in time. Tristan felt relief well up in his throat at the sight of the lightning-struck tree he recognized from earlier, knowing it meant they were close, but ahead of him the others were no longer moving. They were hiding behind the hollow of a birch, eyes ahead, and he joined them with great care to be quiet. The rest of their crew was out of hiding, a half-open lantern by Sonali's foot casting its glow over the clearing. The Milani huntsman had his musket out and pointed, the others around bearing their own arms. It was plain to see why. Facing them were a dozen armed hollows. The other war band, Tristan thought through clenched teeth. The one that had been fleeing the beast. He pulled his knife. Yang had a pistol in hand and was already loading it with powder, while Ferranda Villazaran sheathed her sword with care to keep the sound low. They were at the back of the cultists, if they struck first. "Peace, strangers," a woman called out. "None of us can afford to spill blood here." Tristan's eyes followed the voice, and what he found gave him pause. The hollows were armed with spears and swords, a few with mail and one a breastplate, but one among them wore only robes and bar no blade. It was a blonde woman with skin pale as milk and a broad face, aged around what must be late 30s. Her eyes were wide and shining, unsettlingly black. She had caught the three of them out, and the advantage now lay with her band, but the enemy did not look eager to fight, a fight Tristan's crew might not win if they forced it. The three of them traded resigned glances before coming out of the trees, carefully circling around the darklings to join the others. "I know that look," Yang said, spitting into the leaves. "Bishop, are you?" "A learned man," the woman praised, tone friendly. "I am Bishop Dion, a servant of the divine." "Lovely to meet you," Lan called out. A rat to the bone, that one, Tristan fondly thought. She'd shake hands with the king of hell himself if she thought him a useful relation. A sentiment shared, Bishop Dion easily replied. "I would have no quarrel between our warbands. We have already suffered losses and abandoned the season of the hunt. Besides, spilling blood will bring the work and God on us all. There are only tears to be had in that." Ferranda had come to stand beside Sonali, sword in hand, and she took the lead. "Then let us all part ways in peace," Lady Ferranda offered. "That would be pleasing," the bishop agreed. "But first I seek of you knowledge of how the walk in God was drawn here. We had lost it, mere hours ago. I believe that change is of your doing, yes?" Hesitation. It was a reasonable thing to ask, but already they could all dimly feel it would not really end at that first request. Perhaps this was, the thief thought, best handled by him. He stepped into the lantern's light and made a show of sheathing his knife. The hollow warriors made no move to return the courtesy, but it drew the bishop's approving eye. "It was a scent," Tristan told her. "Medicine I carried that also happens to draw the attention of gods. It has all been spent." He disliked speaking up, drawing attention to himself like this, but they needed to go and he didn't trust anyone else to get it done as quickly. Every breath spent here was one less between them and the beast. The priestess smiled pleasantly. "And how am I to know you speak truth?" she asked. "You might have cursed my war band the same way." She wanted something, as he'd thought. She's mentioned losses earlier, so maybe she wanted a prize to compensate for them. Something to bring back home to avoid the perception of complete defeat. Already he was going through his options, finding what he might offer as a bribe, and opened his mouth to. Yang casually lowered his pistol and shot a hollow. A scream of pain, followed by more of surprise and anger. Swords and spears rose on the other side, pistols and blades on theirs, but Tristan's eyes were on the bishop. And when he saw the expression that flickered there, he understood that Yang had not been so reckless after all. Bishop Dion was not furious, for all that Jair face now showed anger. For the barest of heartbeats she had been amused. When Tristan's eyes moved, he was not surprised to find that Yang had only shot the warrior in the leg. "You offer insult, stranger," Dion said. "I offer a gift," Yang replied without batting an eye. "A man you know you will outrun. Let us part on those terms, Bishop," for you will get no more of us." The soul man in mail pleaded something to his priest in a guttural language. If Tristan were inclined to bet, he'd say he was asking for permission to fight. "There is no need for that, Vasile," Bishop Dion smiled. "Let us accept this gift in the spirit it was meant. Come here, Alan." Grimaces bloomed across the faces of her warriors, and the wounded man took a step back, eyes wet with tears. "No, Bishop," Alan pleaded, "I swear I would." The priest laid a hand on his head, and there was a small stir of wind. The warrior shivered, only for him to straighten his back as she withdrew her fingers. "I take your pain for an hour, my son," Dion said. "You have a chance now, outwit the god, or earn the honor of its teeth." They had just cast him out, Tristan thought. The smell of blood was sure to draw the Heliodorine beast, so he must be left behind. And part of him felt horror at how easily that life had just been thrown away, but the part had been trained, the one that kept him alive all these years, was instead fitting pieces together. The Erevatin had slain trial takers and cultists both the day before the Bluebell docked, but there had been no trace of them impaled inside its maw when he saw inside yesterday. They are only kept there until death, he decided. How long did it take a man to die from impalement? There was no telling, unless you knew where they got impaled, and that was impossible to predict. But the odds were still worth it. Bishop Dion flicked a glance their way. "Let us part ways in peace, as was offered," she said, and ironically looked to the offer. "No," Tristan said, and stepped forward. "What are you?" Someone silenced Felix as the thief took his cabinet off his back, opening it up. He took out 2 vials, then a rag to go with them. He only had 2 clean ones left. At this rate he'd run out. "What are your intentions, child?" the bishop asked. "I am a physician," Tristan lied. "I have taken oath to help those who suffer, even darklings. Let me treat his wound." Dion looked taken aback. The hollow she had already good as cast out turned a pleading look on her, so she ended up nodding her head with open bemusement. "You may proceed." "Sit down," Tristan ordered the man. Drenching the rag in alcohol, he cleaned the wound and explained to Alan that he could not risk taking out the lead ball inside his leg lest he be at risk of bleeding out. Instead he cleaned the burns and wrapped the wounds with the last of his bandages before offering the man vial to drink. "It will kill the pain for half a day," he said. "It will also taste foul, but drink the whole thing anyway." The hollow gratefully nodded and downed it, almost retching at the taste. He handed back the vial and Tristan rose to his feet before helping him up. "It is all I can do," the thief said. "I can only wish you good luck." "You have done much already, Alan," his Antigua faintly guttural. "My blessings go with you, son of the Radiance." Now there was something to trouble a man's sleep. Tristan smiled back anyway. Bishop Dion approached, giving a weeing look, and leaned close. "I thank you for the kindness, child," she said. "It is almost a shame that you are all already dead." Somehow he suspected she had not become a bishop because of her bedside manner, but that was fine. He had not done a kindness at all. Their groups parted ways with fewer glares than there had been a moment ago, though no one from either side had loosened their grip on their weapon. The last Tristan saw of them was the wounded warrior being encircled by the others, a chant beginning on the priest's lips, and then they were hurrying away. Not long after they were out of sight he was pulled to the fore. "Why did we just waste time watching you pretend to help the Darkling?" Young bluntly asked. "Pretend?" Feranda said, surprised. "He is out of painkillers," Sare told her. "What did you actually make him drink, Tristan?" "Volsian you," the thief said. "My entire stock." Sonali let out a hard bark of laughter. "A poison?" Young frowned. "Only for spirits," the Milani grinned. "Clever man." "The Erevatin is going to be eating our friend soon enough," Tristan said. "And when it does, it will also be eating a bellyful of poison." The Heliodorine beast ate the corpses it impaled inside its own maw. It must, for there had been no trace of the first wave of trial takers there when he had seen inside the mouth yesterday. The thief suspected that they were kept impaled so long as they lived to suffer and were consumed when dead. That was his bet. that the hollow would die quick enough inside them off of the poison and him to matter. Now all that was left was to run and hope the roll of the dice went their way. Chapter 18. Tristan couldn't quite believe it when they broke the tree line. "It's the right place," Sarah fervently told him. "The hills are in the right arrangement." She had to be right. She was no fool, and she had the map tucked away inside her mind through a sign, and yet the thief felt no relief. Before them a great clearing in the forest was stretching out, rolling hills and a stretch of gleaming grass. Miles of open land, with trees on all sides save the north, where the ravine lay, and the bridge to cross it. Tristan spat to the side, for his mouth tasted iron after all the running, and looked behind. The others were catching up, the fit in the knot. The former clustered together, keeping the same exhausted but unrelenting pace, while the latter trailed behind. Young, Sonali, Firanda, Lan. All these were mere moments behind he and Sarah. It was the others they waited for until they came out one by one. It took nearly 10 minutes. Vanessa had not got quicker for the evening's exertions, and Francia was barely ahead of her. As for Felix, it had been only a matter of time until his lick of dust feverish burst of energy passed, and once it had, he'd become a shambles. That ain't stayed with him was as much a result of her poor shape as loyalty to her hanging rope of a marriage, Tristan suspected. She was barely faster on her feet than the gray hairs now, evidently not used to lasting exercise. And yet they were catching up, all of them. They had all made it. "I thought we'd lose at least one of the elders," Young admitted. "It is a bruising pace we have kept." "Tough," Sonali appreciatively said. "Desperations is a kind of strength," Lan said. "And even the old girl wants to live, deep down." The thief caught her eye and dipped his head in agreement. Vanessa had not given up. She might not expect to live through this, but neither was she ready to lay down and die. It was worthy of respect, as much as the freely gifted kindness. As the laggards entered the light of the lantern, Tristan saw how worn down they had become. Expectedly so, it had been punishing work moving through the woods even with their lanterns now wide open. They had followed the edge of the ravine to avoid getting lost, following it east until the tree line broke. They'd passed two more rings of raised stones as they did, one intact, the other shattered, and the second they had passed not even a half hour ago. Whatever they might once have been used for, they now made for useful landmarks. When the last of them, a sweaty and disheveled Vanessa, caught up, the lot of them shared a brief rest. "We're close, then?" Felix raggedly asked. Sarah pointed slightly to the northwest, past two high hills. "The bridge is there," she said. There can be no doubt. Far be it from him to argue with the woman who had used magic to memorize the map. Even the most exhausted of them picked up the pace at her words, elation and relief limbering slowing feet. Even Tristan found a smile tugging at his lips. It seemed they had reached salvation before the monster caught up with them, after all. He crested a hill, then another, and saw the dirt path laid down before him. Then the relief caught in his throat. Lemures. Lupines, a whole pack of them. Though Ains and Young were standing at his side within moments, not a single of the beasts glanced their way. They were too busy tearing hungrily into corpses. Slowly coming down the hill, hand on his knife, he took a closer look at the bodies. Hollows, Tristan recognized. Less than half a day dead, and as the light of the lantern reached the bridge beyond the lupines he remembered the bishop's smiling curse, "You are all already dead." The corpses being eaten had been crushed and stomped, as if by a great beast. These were, he realized, the losses Bishop Dion had talked about. The priestess herself might have been here mere hours ago. One after another, he fit the pieces together. Standing there alone with closed eyes, he painted the picture the way Abuela had taught him to. By the time the Bluebell had come ashore, the cultists had already been stirred up from the debacle that woke up the Erevatin. The Warband split, some roving the land while the largest claimed the western and eastern bridge. The morning after Jew was murdered, the trial takers split into bands of their own, but their story was not Tristan's trouble. What he cared for was the bridges. After Inyani and her fellows fought their way through the western bridge, the Erevatin went mad from whatever had confused it and collapsed the bridge. What, then, were the Hollows to do? Everyone headed east. So, eventually, did the Aravetan. The monster slew a few Arbrans and some went into hiding, but what Tristan and the others had deduced when they first laid their plans was still true. The cultists did not help each other, they were rivals. And so no one went to warn the large war band holding the eastern bridge, led, he now believed, by Bishop Dion, that a monster was on the prowl. The cultists were taken entirely by surprise when it attacked them. That war band had been hit tonight, mere hours ago. It was why the tracks Sonali had found earlier were fresh. The cultists been fleeing the beast by going east into the woods, away from this deadly clearing. After finishing up here, the Aravetan had followed in their direction but been lost, perhaps because of the rain, which would dampen how it smelled. It had still moved east somewhat, though, and been close enough to immediately smell the lodestone extract when Tristan used it. Which brought them to here and now, the cultist camp of a rival war band destroyed, their own crew running for the bridge before the Heliodorn beast turned on them. And now they came to the reason Bishop Dion had called them dead. Tristan opened his eyes as the light of the lantern carried by Yang passed the corpses in lupines to the bridge, through which some cultists had tried to flee and where the monster caught up to them. And when it struck them down, in its rage it must have collapsed the wooden bridge. Now only shattered edges on both sides of the ravine remained, the rest long fallen into the river below. There would be no crossing here. They were stuck on this side, with the beast and the hollows. No, Ains shouted. The lupines did not even care enough about the noise to abandon their meal. Despair trembled in the air, not one of them denying its sting. It was too long for a jump across, Tristan thought. And they did not have a rope long enough to attempt another kind of crossing. Even Sarah's face fell, though she was the first to gather herself. If we go west, the river grows wider and stronger but there is no ravine, she said. Swimming through there is the only way left. Half of them wouldn't make that swim, the thief thought. Neither of the elders, probably not Ains either, and he was not so sure of Lan. Gods, he was not so sure of himself. He was fit but no great swimmer, and the watch had built bridges on the island for a reason. But it was all that remained, so he put away his doubts and breathed in. He let out his breath and his fear with it. Let's go, he said. No time to waste. If they waited for too long their company was sure to fall into arguments and backbiting, which would eat into their chances of losing the Aravetan. So he began setting out, nudging Sarah to do the same. She gave him a long look, then nodded and followed. Behind them he heard Felis comfort his wife and yell something out at Young, but Tristan met the Tianxi's eyes and the soldier snorted. Ignoring Felis, he joined them in working away. After that, the simple pressure of people leaving forced the rest to make a decision, stay or follow. Enough followed that the rest feared to stay. It was not a solid foundation, the thief knew, but the worst had happened and so he must adjust his expectations. There could be no more sentimentality. Feranda sought him out at the front, having surprised him when she and Sonali stuck with them. You have a scheme in mind, she said. What is it? Going west, he flatly replied. If we live through the day then we can revisit how we will cross. She grimaced. Fair enough, Feranda replied. We will stay with you for now, but make no promises for tomorrow. He shrugged. The pair were far from dead weight, and he'd given due thought to Sonali's offer, but trackers were no longer needed. It would be hard to get lost now that they had found the river. All that remained was to find a way to cross it. It had earlier taken most of an hour for them to get to the bridge, and now they squeezed out much the same hurrying through the hills. In a few miles west the woods would begin again, continuing until they broke for another plain at the heart of the island, where the other bridge lay. Past that, at least a full day west, was where Sari was suggesting they attempt the crossing. Only when they were out of breath did they call their first halt. The pretense that they were all in this together had worn thin, both the gray hairs had been lagging behind again, the same for Ains and Felis, and no one moved to help them. They would catch up exhausted to the remainder of the group only by the time it set out, the thief estimated, and so be forced to continue without rest. It was a slow death sentence, but Tristan hardened his heart. He no longer had the luxury of caring about anything but survival. Huh? Yang said. unusual. Panting and on his knees, Tristan turned to follow the Tianxi's gaze. Further along the ravine, it was wider here, likely why the bridge had been built further east. There were rings of raised stones. 2 of them, rather close, and in near perfect state. Whoever the builders had been, they had made them to last. It was not long after the second ring the forest began again, the clearing come to an end. After entering those woods it ought to take at least half a day until they found open grounds again, which he did not look forward to. It was vicious kind of irony that Tristan and his fellows were to see twice as many bridges anyone from the Bluebell, yet all of them would be broken. And now remembering the other bridge's fate, which he had known of for an entire day, he cursed himself for not having considered the same might happen again. It was plain that the Blastcloaks had not built bridges strong enough to withstand the Lemure, that they had expected the Erveton to remain sleeping. He'd had the right knowledge in his pocket all along and never thought to put it to use. The others were further apart. Yang breathed out. The thief blinked for a moment before realizing Yang was still talking of the stone circles. Maybe we're near the middle, Tristan shrugged. Francio believed they followed the length of the river, from east to west, but he might have been wrong. The thief got back on his feet, meeting the Yang's eyes. A nod was shared and they began to move again, setting out at a pace that was not quite a run but far from walking. This was to be a trial of endurance, not a quick race. Tristan forced himself not to think about the fact that Francio and Vanessa had not yet caught up. Half an hour later they were slightly past the second of the rings, not even a quarter hour away from the woods resuming to the west. The thief slowed for a heartbeat, convinced he'd seen a light inside the stones. But it was nothing, only a stone smoothed by rain reflecting the stars. However, he breathed out, not sure whether he was relieved or disappointed. The answer was soon settled, however, as the little he had turned was enough for him to catch sight of something that froze his limbs. Behind them, to the east, mist was billowing past the crest of the hills. His breath caught. If the mist was close enough for him to see without even lantern light, then there was no outrunning the monster. The Heliodorn beast had caught up, and what could the likes of them do against such a creature? He was going to die here in the dark, surrounded by strangers. Tristan breathed in, breathed out. Remember your lessons. What he could not do did not matter, so what could he do? If the monster could not be fled from, it must be tricked. Tristan, Sarah called out, but then she turned to follow his gaze and her voice went out like a candle in the wind. The thief did not answer, eyes staying fixed on the Heliodorn beast. In the distance he could see the white fog slowly but surely gaining on Vanessa, ever the last of them. She had yet to notice. Sarah pulled at his arm, fingers squeezing hard at his flesh. "We need to go," she hissed. "I know you're letting fear do your thinking for you," Tristan said, tone even. "We had at least an hour on it, running on open grounds while it was in the woods. We cannot flee from it, Sarah, we're simply not fast enough." He straightened his back. "As our good friend the bishop said, we must outwit the god or earn the honor of its teeth." Sarah loudly swallowed. "You said to stick close to you, if this went bad," she said. "I can perhaps keep us alive, and another as well," he admitted. "But I am not sure how long. It would be a gamble." While they were covered in magic feathers reeking of sleep, the beast should not eat them, but they would be unconscious and he would have to hope the Lemure kept chasing the others instead of taking the time to stomp them out of spite. By the way her breathing grew uneven, Sarah was panicking. He did not blame her. "You've just Gota said we're going to die, how are you so fucking calm?" she demanded. Did he seem that way? He did not feel it. There was a wild animal clawing at his insides, even if it had yet to break the cage. "I am terrified," Tristan honestly told her. "My limbs are trembling and my mind is mush. But it doesn't matter, because I know where we are." "Where?" she snarled. "In a grave," the rat grinned. "We have nothing left to lose, Sarah, either we buy our way out or we stay buried. Fear only matters if it can still get worse." She let out a hiccup that was half indignation and half laughter. "Gods," she croaked. "No wonder the masks want you." Masks, did she mean the Cryptia? No, now was not the time. There would be time to ask what one of the circles of the watch might want with him if they lived. Instead he clapped her shoulder comfortingly and his eyes went back to their coming doom. By his count Vanessa was a quarter hour behind them, to the east, and the beast would catch up to her around the time she reached the first ring of stones. Indeed, now that the mist was spreading further across the wet grass he could make out the Airvatan's silhouette in starlight. The monster was following her doggedly. Vanessa had noticed the monster at last and broken into a run that slowly curved north towards the ravine. Hurrah again, Tristan thought with a sliver of grief, and the beast had followed the adjustment exactly. Almost, he frowned, to exactly. Sorry, he said, is it me or is the Airvatan running strangely? Afraid or not, the blue-eyed woman had not fallen to pieces. They stood there in silence for a long moment, gaze following the same great beast. It's not moving across the hills well, she murmured. It keeps almost tripping on the slopes. Why? It's blind, Tristan breathed out, excitement rising. It wasn't enough poison to kill it, but it went blind. He suspected the beast had been blind when it began following them across the plains. Surely it would not have been able to hear them from so far away, but now the Volsian U had taken its sight. It could still get around somehow, and track them, but the way it kept walking on things instead of over them was telling. It's still following Vanessa, Sare said. The impact of feet on the ground. No, then it would feel the slopes and the stones when its footsteps make them shake. It must be the sound, it is listening to her run. Then hiding would be pointless, Tristan noted. If it can hear her from that far away, there is no way to hold our breath for long enough. It won't hear us. We need protection, she said. Something to hide behind. We could try going down the side of the ravine. Tristan grimaced, shaking his head, and even Sare looked unconvinced. The beast would be able to reach them with its tentacles. Gods, the monstrosity was longer than the ravine was large. But there was one detail that he'd had in the back of his mind since earlier, an oddity about how the monster had attacked the cultist camp. I think I have something, Tristan admitted. But there will be no way to tell if it works until it's on us. Blue eyes met his and she hesitated. He was, in practice, asking her to bet her life on his hunch. They had known each other for mere days, and spent much of these hiding secrets from one another, and her expression hardened and she offered her arm. She had, he sensed, come to a decision. Not just about the needs of the moment, but deeper things still. Gently, almost reverently, he clasped the proffered arm. Mariam, she said. My name is Mariam Kamef. If I am to trust you with my life, I should trust you with that. He swallowed. Tristan a rascal, he said, lips gone dry. It was the first time he had said his surname in years, and he shivered at hearing it. Let's live, Tristan, Mariam smiled. After that, it would be embarrassing not to. He grinned back, minutes away from death, and terrified and somehow more alive than he'd been since he was a boy. They went back to the first ring of stones. This was madness, so naturally even after the others noticed they were no longer running and turned back to ask, few were inclined to follow. This is madness, Fernando Vilazar flatly informed him. As always, the Infanzona caught on quickly. I am aware, Tristan said. It might, however, be the useful kind of madness. The fair-haired noblewoman studied him for a moment, then shook her head. Her plain face was drawn with exhaustion, but her expression remained steadfast in a stolid sort of way. I wish you well, but I will not risk my life so recklessly, Fernando told. We part ways here. Or so she said, but then she glanced at Sonali, who nodded after a heartbeat. Reassured, her face firmed. Their decision was made. Good luck, Tristan said, and was surprised to find her meant the words. You too, Sonali said, offering his hand. Keep your knife close. Better to die quick if can. It was said with such friendly concern that the thief could not even find it in himself to be offended at the presumption they were all about to die, shaking it. They were not truly friends, though perhaps in time they could have become something close to it, but the pair had been more than tolerable to work with. It was already better than he had ever expected to think of an Infanzona. When Lady Feranda offered her hand, he shook it as well. The two hurried away after rushing through goodbyes, heading west for the woods. Lan followed behind them, offering only a cheerful wave before legging it. The three had lost some time doubling back, but likely expected to make it back while the Erevatin murdered everyone staying behind. Young watched them go, then grimaced. "Now would be a good time to tell me you put some lodestone in their bags," the Tianxi said. "Alas, I used the full stock," Tristan easily replied. "I was afraid you'd stay that," Yang sighed. "Is the plan really to hide inside the stone rings and pray they keep the monster out?" "I don't intend to pray," Sarah informed him. He glared at her. "You two are a bad influence on each other," he said, then turned to spit on the grass. He sighed and began to load his musket. "I think this might be the most idiotic plan I've ever followed," Yang said, "and I've served with militia officers from Mazu." Tristan cocked an eyebrow. He knew little of that republic save that it was one of the foremost naval powers of the Trebian Sea. "Half the promotion examination is about poetry," Yang scathingly said. "What I choose to take from this is that my insight matched that of trained military officers," Tristan proudly replied. "Come on, let's go hide in the rings." Their company had spread out. Feranda and Sonali had pulled ahead to the west and were minutes away from the woods, a surprisingly quick Lan a notch behind them, while further back Ains and Felis were getting close to the first ring of stones. A few minutes behind them Francio was limping, and even further beyond that Vanessa struggled to catch up. Tristan worried his lip, evaluating the distances. He had the time, narrowly. "We have 2 lanterns," he said. "Let us put one in each ring." It was as clear a signal he could risk considering that shouting would likely attract the beast. Seeing a lantern in the eastern ring might induce the others to try going inside it. "Soft touch," Yang chided, but it was without heat. The Tianxi stayed in the second ring while he and Sarah brought the lantern to the first, running back when they saw how close the Erevatin was getting. They left just as Ains and Felis arrived, the pair looking baffled as they entered the ring. Even from there they could see Young waiting in the other, his silhouette clear in the other lantern's light, so though the wedded pair shouted questions that Tristan did not turn to answer, they stayed inside in mimicry of the Tianxi. The surprise was that, by the time they got back to the western ring, Lan was running towards it as well. When she stumbled past the circle of raised stones, falling on her knees in the grass, she gave them a blue grin. "Decided to bet on you this time," Lan explained. It was just as likely she had realized she was not as physically fit as the pair in front of her and was likely to get eaten while they kept running, but Tristan decided not to be unpleasant. It was not impossible they were all about to die. Instead he went for the edge of their circle of stones, leaning against the tall stone and watching as the Erevatin closed the last of the distance to the eastern ring. Francio had made it inside, falling to his hands and knees before the other two as they held each other, and it left there was only Vanessa. She went straight for the ring, as quick as she could, while behind her Mist followed. "Make it," Tristan encouraged. "Come on, you can make it." Mist spread past her and the shadow loomed tall, the ground shaking silently beneath its feet, but she was there. Fingers biting into the palm of his hand until they bled, Tristan watched as the old woman got 3 feet away from the edge of the ring, and slipped. "No," he breathed out. She fell, face forward, and a third of her body made it into the ring. The Erevatin's leg, tall and large as pillar, rose and came down, but Felis, in a burst of courage, left his wife and caught Vanessa's arm. He dragged her forward. It was not enough. Vanessa screamed, one of her legs snapping like a twig. But she lived. Felis had pulled quickly enough that it had been a leg instead of her body up to the rib cage, and as the Erevatin stomped furiously around the ring of raised stones the dust fiend finished dragging her inside. And though he'd just seen a woman's leg become a ruin of bone and broken flesh, Tristan's eyes widened in elation at what he saw. The beast's mist did not enter the ring of stones. It refused to. That was the reason they had been able to hear Vanessa scream at all. Young cursed softly in Cathayan as the heliodorant beast's tentacles felt out the stones, trying to reach through them but sliding as if against glass. It had done the same thing, back at the cultist camp, but the ring there had been broken. "You were right, you little madman," Yang said. "You were fucking right." Sorry, Mariam, though he did not yet think of her that way, found his hand and squeezed it. He squeezed back. "My wisdom is being followed as well," Lan smugly said. "Just look at them run." He followed her gaze, finding that Firanda and Sonali were doubling back. They must have seen the rings truly were a protection, and realized their safety was the best chance for them to live through the night. The situation had changed the moment the monster was kept at bay by the stones. Now the Aravetan might well abandon the prey beyond its reach for easier kills, and the pair were the only two on the table. Yet their earlier advantage, how quickly they had run, was now turning against them. They were too far. With rising horror, Tristan turned to see the Aravetan striding away from the other ring. It had heard them doubling back. The coolness in the back of his mind, the part that had been trained, measured the spans and the speeds. The Aravetan, rushing from west to east. The pair, rushing from east to west. Firanda and Sonali were closer to the eastern ring than the Aravetan was, but the beast moved almost twice as quickly and would not tire. It was a done deal, and it became terribly obvious within a minute of the ugly race beginning that the pair would not get there in time. The truth of that sunk in them like rain, soaking them to the bone. Sarah closed her eyes in grief. Glenn smiled in poorly hid relief at how close she had cut it. Yang clenched his teeth and strode to the edge of the ring to shoot his musket at the Aravetan, which had gotten close enough for it. The lemure turned one of its eyeless heads their way, but otherwise ignored them. The Tianxi might as well have shot at a fortress wall. The lovers saw it as well, though the realization hit them in waves. First fear spurred them to drop their lantern and all their bags and save one, sprinting as fast as they could. It was a straight line east to the ring, for them, but already the beast was of a height with it. It would be standing between them and safety within moments. Tristan watched as fear was replaced by despair, by anger. Firanda slowed, taking out something from their last bag and trying to strike a match. She failed, even after trying thrice. The mist kept killing the flame. Sonali had stayed with her, and now their fate was plain. The Aravetan was between them and the stone ring. Yang shot at the monster's back again, but it didn't even twitch. The lover's stride faltered, for a moment, and then Sonali said something before pressing a soft kiss against the side of Firanda's neck. Before the Infanzona could finish turning to see his face, the Milani swerved away. South, away from the ring, and screaming at the top of his lungs in Amoya. Both the beast and the woman hesitated for half a heartbeat. Face ashen, eyes tearing up, Firanda Velazar resumed sprinting for the ring. It was out of her hands now. She must know that all she could do was try not to waste his sacrifice. And the Aravetan, well, it did what all hungry and spiteful lemures did when denied getting everything they wanted. It went to vent its anger on the most insolent of the prey, the Milani, provoking it. Tristan did not remember walking to the edge of the ring or taking out his knife, or his fingers closing around the Sathara in his bag. And as he watched Firanda Velazar approach salvation, he saw how Sonali had not yet abandoned the thought of survival. He had taunted the lemure, got it to head further away from the ring, but now he had cut a sharp turn and was sprinting for it himself. The Aravetan was too close. Tall legs swallowed the distance, unerring on the grass, and though the Milani was swift as Catty was so much smaller. "Please," Firanda Velazar shouted, not even yet in the ring. "Please, if you can do anything, I beg you." Tristan looked away. Fortuna was leaning against the stone opposite his, eyes unreadable. Flicking a wrist, she twirled a coin between her fingers. Unearthly in the thin starlight, a slice of blood and gold cutting into the gray and green of the dominion. His bet to make, she did not need to say. It always was. Fuck, the thief cursed. It was foolish, it was going to get himself killed and he wasn't even going to get anything out of it. He ripped the Sathara out of his bag, smashing the pommel of his knife into the belly. It cracked and he hit it again, twice more until it was open and a single loosened blue feather came drifting out. Dropping the knife, he ran out of the ring. Mist was lapping at the bottom of the stones and he hurried through, finding it thick as smoke but easy to breathe in. Grabbing the edge of the cithara, he inclined it so the feathers wouldn't spill out and silently screamed his terror into the stillness. 10 strides, 20, and the Aravatan's long legs caught up to Sonali. The ground trembled and the sure-footed huntsman tripped. It was now or never, Tristan knew, and he threw the cithara. He hesitated, for the barest of moments, to pull on his contract. But the price. When the stakes were so high, only certain death moved him to use it. So he only threw. The moment he did, he knew he had failed. The arc was too short. He could still. But he did not, for in the end Tristan was yet a rat. It would surely get him killed, so instead of pulling at the par inside him he watched as the cithara flew up only to drop half a dozen feet short of Sonali just as he was grabbed by Heliodor Beast. Tristan turned without stopping to look at what would follow. The silence was a mercy. Heart thundering in his ears, the thief felt the ground shake behind him and the beast gain ground. He had gone too far, or he'd not gone far enough, but whatever the truth of it, Tristan knew in his bones that he was going to die. The lantern trembled ahead of him, inside the ring, carving out the silhouettes of the others. One came closer than the rest. Sorry. No, too tall. Roll, Fortuna hissed. He obeyed without hesitation, feeling a tentacle grab behind him. He rose into a run as the Aravatan struck at the ground in anger. In front of him the silhouette grabbed at something he could not make out. A match cracked, the heartbeat of light revealing red-eyed Feranda, and she lit something in her hands. The ground shook behind him and Tristan almost tripped, stumbling into a sharp turn to the left instead, but the game was up. He had slowed. The beast had him. You need to, Fortuna began, but he never heard the rest. Something went flying above his head, something Feranda Vilazar had thrown, and after a heartbeat instead of death Tristan felt heat licking at his back. There was a detonation and burst of light as he ran as fast as he could, and he heard the Aravatan scream in pain even through the Lemur's own mist. He threw himself in the grass past the ring of stones, landing painfully on his arms but too wildly relieved to care. Behind him the world shook, the beast furiously stamping the ground around the raised stones. But he'd gotten through, gods. By the skin of his teeth, but he still lived. Rolling his belly up, panting, he found the Infanzona's eyes. Thank you, he got out. Her lips thinned. You tried, Feranda simply said, and looked away. He had no answer to that, and so instead he dropped his head back in the grass and waited for his limbs to cease shaking. When they did, Sari was there to help him up while he caught the tail of talk between the others. Was that? Zhenxianli, Yang said. A grenade. Though one filled with more than powder. Phosphorescent salts, Feranda quietly said. It is a Milani trick. Tristan would have shared in the sliver of the grief he saw in those eyes, had he the time. Knowing he owed his life in part to the man he had failed to save was a humbling thing. But sentiment would have to wait, for the beast lingered. This was the part where planning stumbled, for how could he know what the monster would do? The answer, it turned out, was throw a tantrum. It stalked around in the silence of its mist, smashing at the ground and trying to wriggle its tentacles around the protection of the stones. The ancient work did not fail, but the Heliodor beast did not tire. What Tristan thought might be it leaving ended up being the creature heading back to the other ring. It kept venting its fury there, terrifying the four inside clustering around their trembling lantern light. We have food and water enough for 2 days, Yang said. No cultists will get anywhere near us while it's here, there is that, Sari sighed. But if it does not leave we may well be stuck here until we starve. It may fake leaving, Lan said. It's what I'd do, let us get far enough from the rings, then attack. Lady Feranda took no place in the talks, out of what the thief thought to be grief, but he had underestimated her. She was crouching by the edge of the ring, staring at something. He joined her there, following her gaze. The grass had split a dozen feet away from them. His heart clenched at the sight. It could be only the one crack, he quietly said. The cultist camp was about this far from the ravine, when part of the cliff came down in the storm, the Infanzona evenly replied. And that was the work of wind and water, not a giant stampeding around. Much as he wanted to deny her, Tristan could not. She was right. If the Erevator kept stomping about, the slice of the cliff on which the ring stood was at risk of collapse. They were too close to the edge, and it seemed that erosion had dug under their feet. Was the eastern ring also at risk? Doesn't matter, Tristan chided himself. There's no way for us to move there while it's prowling the grass. It seemed they did not have 2 days after all, but instead hours, or less, if they were unlucky. Tristan rose and walked away, leaving to Feranda the unpleasant task of breaking the news to the others even. It was unkind, when she was in fresh grief, but he could not bring himself to care. Instead he went to the northern edge of the ring, the one overlooking the ravine. He could not make out the water at the bottom, it was too deep for that, but he could hear it. It was not the depth but the length that had killed them, the ravine just long enough that neither jump nor rope would work, though he thought that if the Heliodorn beast took a long enough run up it might make it across. Staring at the dark below, he found himself empty of ideas. Part of him still believed that given long enough their company would figure out a way to get across, but what did that matter when the beast would send them tumbling down long before that? It needed to be. Exclamations of surprise from the others drew his eye. The beast had been striking at the bottom of the raised stones of the other ring and some piece of rubble come loose. The Erevator charged it without missing a beat, furiously attacking the ground until the shard was nothing but powder. It turned back to besieging the ring after, which mercifully held even missing a piece. For now. The thief worried his lip. Had it been this aggressive before? He thought not. It had liked the fear, to make them run and cower. Now it struck to kill from the start. "Young," he said. "I need you to do something for me." The Tianxi cocked an eyebrow but let himself be drawn into the scheme. It was a simple thing, after all, the testing of a guess. The former soldiers loaded his musket, aimed and fired at the ground to the east, as close as he could to the Heliodorn beast while keeping a strong impact. The monster turned immediately, abandoning the other ring to charge at where the ground was shot and stomped the spot thoroughly. It's not thinking anymore, Tristan decided. That grenade angered it beyond reason. That was. It was a fool's notion, but what else was left save the likes of these? He took Mariam, aside. "What can you do with signs?" he quietly asked. She grimaced. "I know 9 but have mastered only 3, she admitted. "All of them are chicks." His confusion must have been plain, for she elaborated without prompting. "Contained within my own mind," Sare said. "The sign I used to keep the map within me, for example." "You made an orb of darkness when we encountered the good bird," he said. "To keep Vanessa from being swept by the river." "It is a sign I learned," she wearily agreed. "But it is demanding and I cannot maintain it for long. The consequences would be unpleasant." He acknowledged that with a nod, but pressed on. "Does it need to be anchored on something like water, or can it hang in the air?" "It needs no anchor," she replied. "It is an exercise of shaping raw loam." "Tristan, what are you scheming?" "Maybe nothing," he admitted. "Maybe something. It depends on how long you can maintain it." She searched his eyes for something. Whatever it was, she found it. "How long do you need?" If it were not plain to everyone by now that they would not survive another hour of the Erevator stomping around their ring, Tristan figured some of them might have called him a fool. The same people likely thought him one in private still, but with death looming so tall at the end of their common road none were willing to spit on even a fool's chance of living through this. Yang caught his shoulder as he prepared to go. He hesitated, breath now smelling of drink in a way that was impossible to mistake even if Tristan had not seen him sneak a lick from his flask. "Good luck," the Tianxi finally said. "And you?" Tristan replied, and on a whim pressed his hat into the man's hands. Hopefully he would be coming back for it. If not, well, why waste a perfectly good hat? Swallowing his fear, the remembrance of the monster's tentacles coming within breaths of seizing him, the thief stepped out of the ring. He did not even need to shout. Within 2 heartbeats the Erevator stopped tormenting the other stone ring and turned west. The difficult part, Tristan had known from the start, would be getting the angle right. There were fixed points and objects in movement. A ring to the east, from which the Erevatin was coming as he headed west, towards the other ring, and Tristan who had just stepped out of it. To the north the ravine, to the south miles of grass and hills until distant woods were reached. Tristan headed south, away from the ravine and onto the grass. The Erevatin charged, eager for violence. Heat pounding in his throat, Tristan fought down the primal urge to run back to the safety of the ring and continued moving south as the creature approached. It was angling away from the ravine and straight towards him, charging blindly as it had for the stone and shot. Breathing ragged, Tristan waited as long as he dared before breaking into a run. Back north towards the ravine, not so far from the same ring he'd come from. The moving parts he had sketched out in his mind came to be, one terrifying heartbeat at a time. Himself, nearing the edge of the ravine to the north. When he did, the ring where the others waited would be directly to his side to the west. Sare would be there, his death or salvation. The Heliodoran beast, on the other hand, took the angle he led it into. By going south he'd drawn it southwest across the span between the rings, and now to catch up to him as he ran north it was turning northwest. Adjusting its angle he got closer and closer to the edge of the ravine. He'd begun running too early out of fear, he realized, so he had to fight down his instincts and slow his steps as the mist billowed past his feet and the beast approached. He felt the ground shiver beneath his feet and hurried, the Erevatin charging after him. It was only mere feet between him and the ravine now. 30, 20, 10. It's close, Fortuna whispered into his ear. Behind you, to the right. There was only one way to live now that he'd got as far, trusting Sare. And so, screaming into the silence at the top of his lungs, Tristan leapt off the edge of the cliff. For a hideous moment he flew, until just ahead of him an orb of darkness formed and he smacked right into its surface. Scrabbling desperately against the gloam, it was neither rough nor smooth, but his weight had him slipping the surface nonetheless. He balled up around the orb and hoped. It was the best he could do, too afraid to try to turn and look back, but he still made himself see it in his mind's eye. The Erevatin was blinded, by both poison and rage, and it was a massive creature on the run. It had been but a heartbeat or two behind him, much too late to turn. Which meant the mist might have covered the grass and smothered sound there, but when the Erevatin tumbled past the edge of the ravine he heard it scrabbling against stone. Thunderous bellows erupted from its maw as it slipped, desperately struggling, and a frenzied laugh escaped his throat. He'd done it. The fucking monster had heard him going north as he leapt and tried to intercept him right into a ravine, which it could not see any more than it had seen the hill slopes. The orb of gloom shivered beneath him and the thief let out a yelp. Now he needed to get out of here before Sare was forced to release the sign. Limbs shaking, he slowly began to wiggle around the orb so he could face the cliff. Every movement sent a thrill of terror up his wrists, the distant roar of the river beneath a reminder of what would happen to him if he slipped. When he finally turned to face the others he saw they had prepared as he'd asked. Young had tied his wrist to his musket, extending it as a perch, and the others, save Sare, were holding on to him. Beneath him the orb wobbled again. The more he let himself think about it, Tristan knew, the deeper the fear would bite. So instead he crawled atop the orb, standing in a crouch as his teeth bit into his lips, and with what little footing he could muster he leapt back towards the cliff. The butt of the musket caught him in the eye. He shouted in pain and terror, his cursed sweating hand slipping against the weapon, but his fingers caught on the lock. The piece of flint cut into his flesh but he held on for dear life, Young and the others shouting as they hoisted him up. Only it wasn't enough, his grip was too weak, and he half sobbed as the musket slid through his fingers. He pulled at his luck. The ticking began but for a searing moment nothing at all happened, until he realized that above him Mariam has slipped on the grass, falling down, belly on the ground, but her torso hanging past the edge of the cliff. Line of sight, he thought, a second before she let out a shout and something solid formed beneath his feet, catching his fall. Another herb. It immediately began breaking apart, but the brief moment had been enough for Young to grab him by the collar. With a heave the former soldier hoisted him up, enough that the others caught him too and he was dragged over the edge. They dropped him face down in the grass and Tristan almost wept. He'd bought his way out of the grave again. He stayed lying there, panting and listening to his heartbeat slow. Clenching his teeth in anticipation, he released the lock he'd borrowed. "Shit," Sarah said. "Tristan, you..." The thief wriggled like a worm, for his feet were on fire. Or so it felt like, when he looked strands of gloom were eating away at his right boot through the bottom. He tried to get it off, but the pain was. Young tackled him, ripping it off, and once the leather was away from his skin the burning stopped. Tristan pulled the sole of his feet close after Young released him, finding the skin was red and raw, already blistering. Gods, that was going to hurt. Still better than falling to his death. He waved away Sarah's apology, something about losing control of the sign, and let himself fall into the grass again. Someone set something down on his belly, and he reached to find it was his tricorn. Grabbing it, he fanned his face and found Young smiling down at him. "Lan's going to get the other 4, he said. "We can all set out together." It was the only way Vanessa would get anywhere, now. Her leg was a ruin. "The beast?" he asked. "See for yourself," Young replied, offering a hand. Tristan took it, rising to finally take a good look at his handiwork. He half-hopped on one foot, leaning against Young. He'd been right, the thief thought when they got close. The Erevator might have made the jump, with long enough a run up. It must have still gotten close, because it was hanging to the other side of the ravine by its head and tentacles. Its back legs propped it up against their side of the ravine as it writhed and tried to climb out, but it was too heavy for the tentacles and a little legwork to be enough. Undone by its own weight, the Erevator was stuck between the sides of the ravine like a cork in a bottle. And the sight of that struck another spark of madness. Because sometimes a problem was a solution. His boot was done coming apart and Sarah told him it was safe, so he tore into his pants and made strips to wrap around the bottom of the boot. A temporary solution, but better than going barefoot. Young asked what he was doing when he limped away, avoiding resting on his bad foot, but he did not reply as he headed back into the grass, where Sonali had been taken after he missed his throw. The Sathara lay broken on the green, stepped on out of spite, and translucent feathers had spilled all over. Tristan took off his hat and knelt by them, stuffing what he could inside a tricorn. He doubled back after, returning to the monster writhing between the cliffs. The Erevator struggled and raged, shaking the earth as it tried to drag itself out of the trap with its tentacles. The complete silence lent the sight a touch of the surreal, as if this were a waking dream, but Tristan's mind felt alight. Hat in hand he limped to the edge of the ravine, the raging Heliodorine beast, and overlooking the great expanse of pale flesh he smiled a cold smile. He emptied the feathers on the beast's back. They fell down in a rain, scattering in a wind that did not exist, and the monster shivered. Its limbs heaved again, then slowly they dropped. It went still save for a slow rising of its breath, remaining stuck between the cliffs from sheer size. Slowly the mist faded, thinning into nothingness, until Tristan could hear someone walking up behind him. Young came to stand at his side, a veiled lantern in hand. "Why bother?" the Tianxi asked. It was already trapped. "What is it you see in front of us, Young?" he asked. "Waste," the Tianxi shrugged. "What would you claim is there?" "A bridge," Tristan the Brascal replied. He went back and took his cabinet, slinging it onto his back with a word, and as he reached the edge of the cliff he pressed his hat down onto his head. Looking down at the Erevator, the thief took a limping step forward. Then another and another, until he was all the way across. The beast did not wake. Not when Tristan did it, and not when all the others followed after him either.